The Prophecy Club, a nationwide television program, a nationwide radio program. The Prophecy Club also hosts approximately 40 major city meetings per month. Our mission is to inform Christians of current events that confirm Bible prophecy, expose the evil devices of Satan, warn believers what is coming to America, challenge people to stop sinning and turn to Jesus with all their heart, and to provide a platform for Christian speakers to be heard.
It's a bald-faced lie.
Using their positions of power and authority in our own government.
The greatest oil field in the world is at the southwest end of the Dead Sea. He said, son, you must warn this nation.
And now your host for the Prophecy Club, Stan Johnson.
Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. The topic of tonight's talk is Weapons of the New World Order. Our speaker is an international speaker and author, and he's going to give you an update on HAARP, spelled H-A-A-R-P. The HAARP project, he's going to be talking about the dysfunction of our military, weapons of the New World Order, things like radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic pulse, extremely low frequency, lasers, chemicals, weather control, militarization of all law enforcement, and new technologies that will eliminate what little privacy we have left. Will you help me welcome Dr. Nick Begich?
Thank you all for being here, and I'll give you a little bit additional background on myself and sort of how I got involved in these issues. And then we'll talk about an update on the HAARP issues and then kind of go from there with the latest material that we've developed. My father was a state senator and later a United States congressman. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines. My area of interest in that field was electrophysiology, which is the effect of electromagnetic fields on the human body, which is what attracted me to these issues to begin with. Because we're really talking about new technologies, a variety of technologies that people need to be aware of, that really are the new direction in which wars will be fought in the future. Some of that we've even seen in the most recent conflicts. But let's talk a little bit about the HAARP project and sort of where that is and what that is for those that may not have heard about it. HAARP is the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project, which is a joint project of the United States Air Force and Navy. It operates in Alaska. And when I first ran into this, it was in a very short article, 5-column-inch article, dealing with that issue, and it was in an Australian journal. Now, I live in Alaska, which is a vast region, but at the same time, it's a very small population. We have only 600,000 people in Alaska, so you tend to be on top of issues that are happening around you. My family's very political, which even makes it more so. We tend to stay on top of what's happening within our region. And reading about the HAARP project, the first thing that struck me is it seemed quite unbelievable. The technology that was being expressed in that article, what it was being asserted to be able to do. Quite frankly, I didn't believe it when I first read it. But my habit is when you read something that's really startling as you go and you check it out and see what's really there. And we're very fortunate in my part of the world, in Anchorage, Alaska, we have one of the federal depositories for federal records, which means that our community library has to produce any federal document that isn't classified if somebody wants it. So it's kind of a nice resource for a researcher when you can go in and ask for virtually anything and they've got to produce it. Now, if it's not there on microfilm, they round it up for us and move it into the library so we can see that material. And there's actually, I think, a little over 70 of those libraries around the country, so they're not very, very common. Likewise, we have extensive microfilm files, and one of those sets of microfilms were the U.S. patents, which were the first place that I went to look, because this technology was asserting a lot of different things, and it was built around what at least appeared in that first article, 3 patents. What we found is there were actually 9 patents surrounding the technology. There were a number of government documents that were public documents, the documents that led to the contract to build the facility, as well as the environmental impact statements, which are required on all major projects. Now, what did that first article say that was so startling? First of all, they were talking about one instrument, the HARP instrument, and this is a radio frequency transmitter. And it's most of the time when you think of radio frequency energy, you think of energy coming off of a transmitter and dissipating very rapidly the further that you get away from the transmitter itself. That's why when you get away from radio stations, the signal gets weaker and weaker and weaker until eventually it disappears. With HARP, they had figured out a way to focus that radio frequency energy, to concentrate it into a relatively small area. And they do this by using a field of antennas, and this field of antennas are fired in a very specific way. And what that causes is the radio frequency energy to go into what's called cyclotron resonance, which can be pictured as sort of a corkscrewing motion that focuses the energy and moves it high up above the atmosphere into an area called the ionosphere. Now, the ionosphere starts about 30 miles above the Earth's surface. It extends for several hundred miles out from there. This is what's responsible for shortwave broadcasts, for instance, being able to be heard around the world, because it skips off of that. It bounces the signal off of the ionosphere. It's very important for communications, both civilian and military, which is one of the reasons the military really wanted to study the ionosphere, to figure out, for instance, right now we're in a solar cycle that disturbs the ionosphere from time to time and causes our communications to not work the way they're supposed to. Radio stations go out, or telecommunication systems don't work smoothly. So the more that we learn about the ionosphere, the more efficient we can manage our communications, as well as if we could ever figure out, and this is what the meat of HARP is about, how to manipulate the ionosphere to create the ideal circumstance to make sure we can carry our communication. That became a compelling interest to the military. At the same time, being able to disturb the ionosphere in a way that would deny, say, our adversaries the ability to communicate. So that was the first major area the military had an interest in terms of the HARP instrument, because here was an instrument that on the ground could focus a tremendous amount of energy up, and then by manipulating that energy, controlling it in very specific ways, a number of weapon effects are possible. And I'm just going to kind of go through some of those quickly because I really want to get onto the new material. But first of all, the first thing was communications. Disrupting communications and carrying our own was one of the big objectives. Along that line, one of the things that was important was the idea of being able to utilize this system for communicating with submarines when they're deep under the oceans. Now, high-frequency signals cannot pass through the ground or the sea very far, so you can't communicate under most communication modes to submarines. So what they use is in Michigan and Wisconsin and on the Aleutian Chain and a number of other places around the world, they have 14 to 26 mile long antennas that are buried under the ground that create a signal called an ELF, an extremely low frequency signal. This is a long wave that penetrates the earth and sea and can be used for communication with a submarine. Now with HARP, instead of having antennas buried under the ground, by pulsing the signal, vibrating that signal, modulating that signal, this high frequency signal, they can actually cause the ionosphere to begin to vibrate in sympathy. And what that does is convert up to a 1,000-mile long portion of the ionosphere into a broadcast antenna that sends an extremely low frequency signal back through the earth and sea. So they actually convert something that God created to do one thing, they convert it from essentially DC current to AC, alternating pulsing current. This then acts as an antenna, sends that energy down, and they can use it for communications. Now, one of the other things that the military uses the same mode of operations for, in fact, in 1996, it's what the Congress appropriated the money for. They said, you can't have any more money unless you prove that you can use this technology for one of their claims, which was called earth-penetrating tomography. In very simple language, what that means in the vernacular would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth several kilometers deep. And this was right after the Gulf War, and everybody's running around looking for the underground nuclear facilities and the chemical and biological plants that we suspected were in Iraq. So this became the priority for the Senate. They wanted to see whether or not this technology could really be used in that way. As a result, they tested that application, they proved that it could work effectively, and they got their money for that year and subsequent years. And it was actually funded under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation of the defense budget in that year. Now, another application along the same line is creating what's called an ELF, extremely low frequency signal. I'm going to get back to that concept as we go on tonight, because there's some other side effects to that we're going to need to discuss. But so we've got communications, and we've got earth-penetrating tomography, or X-raying the Earth in the vernacular. The next thing that comes out with this technology is its over-the-horizon radar capability. Now, when you think of the Earth, the curvature of the Earth, standard radars were essentially line of sight. They figured out a way to look around the actual curvature of the Earth for incoming objects. Now, the old technology, as objects came close in, they became highly distorted because the technology wasn't sophisticated enough to keep that distortion from occurring. At the same time, you could pick up things from a very high elevation, but things like a cruise missile wouldn't show up on the old over-the-horizon radar technology. With HAARP, you see everything from ionospheric levels, which is where intercontinental ballistics missiles carrying nuclear warheads would be coming in from, all the way down to cruise missile heights. So essentially you see everything. You don't get distortion coming close in, and you can see around the curvature of the Earth. So over-the-horizon radar. Now, taking that to the next step, when you create the energy field that allows you the over-the-horizon radar capability, if you increase the power slightly, every object coming in has a signature, an energy signature around it. Now, with satellite-based technologies, and there's a patent dealing with this in this cluster of patents, you can actually deduce which of those incoming objects are carrying nuclear payloads. Because when they carry nuclear payloads, they have a very unique signature, an electromagnetic signature that shows up. Now, given that, the way they always envisioned a nuclear attack was a threat cloud would come in, and this would mean that you'd have as many as 100,000 incoming objects. And the idea was that a few hundred or maybe 1,000 would carry nuclear payloads. And the idea was you overwhelm your enemy so that they target everything and some of them get through. And this was the whole idea around having way more missiles than we needed to destroy the Earth. I don't know how many times before they started to disarm some of them, but also to overwhelm with decoys so that you could always be able to get some through. But if you can figure out where the real threat is, I mean, granted, the ones that are not nuclear armed still create damage, but if you could take out those with nuclear payloads, you reduce the amount of damage that would take place on U.S. soil. Going the next step, if you increase the energy even more in this over-the-horizon mode, you can create what's called an electromagnetic pulse. Now, this is a surge of energy that allows for the interference with the avionics, the things that control the flight path, the onboard computers controlling these sophisticated missiles, causes them to malfunction, and the crafts crash. Now, electromagnetic pulse was first discovered, and some will remember this, back when they were doing the atomic tests in the South Pacific, and they had blasted one off of the ocean quite a distance up from the ground. But what it did is it created this surge of energy that knocked out power in Hawaii for a couple hours. And this was back in 1962, 63, right around in that time frame. And the government started looking at that and saying, if we could create a surge of energy, maybe without atomics or nuclear blasts, maybe we can use this to disrupt communication. And many will remember hearing the warning that if we ever had a nuclear attack and just one went off far enough up above the United States, it would knock out all the electronics across the country, everything from toaster ovens to sophisticated computers. And that's what they were talking about, this electromagnetic pulse capability. But now with this instrument, you have the ability to artificially create it without the nuclear fallout, which is quite advantageous from a military perspective. At the same time, some other things came up with HAARP, the idea of transferring energy from one point on the planet to another. In other words, focusing this radio frequency energy up into the ionosphere, bouncing it off of reflectors, and then reconfiguring it on some other part of the planet into electrical energy. Because what you have is essentially, to get from A to B, you get natural gas or some fuel source that converts to electricity, converts to radio frequency, goes through the antenna array, bounces off, comes back as radio frequency, and then gets converted back into electrical energy. Now, they believe that that idea actually is economic around 2004 for some parts of the world that don't have ready supplies of energy. But in a battle situation where you need a lot of energy and the battlefield environment, you can see what the interest would be. Now, the problem with that one is, any of you ever done any carpentry work, you know that if you're like got a 40-foot room across and you get a 1/16 of an inch out at one end, you know you start getting several inches out on the other. Well, figure that out in terms of something on the ground and something many, many miles above the Earth's surface. If you're slightly out, or you get a solar wind that knocks the reflector slightly out, you've got this blast of energy running through your neighborhood instead of where it's intended to go. So that's a bit of a problem, and one that I don't think can easily be overcome, but nonetheless, it was one of the things within this cluster of patents. Now, Bernard Eastland, Dr. Bernard Eastland, was the inventor of the primary patents dealing with this technology. He was also the person that put together the original teams for this project. And Dr. Eastland had a couple of other ideas. One of them is that using the same array, you could actually change the chemical composition of the upper atmosphere by creating chemical reactions using this instrument. For instance, he suggested you'd be able to increase ozone, increase the ozone available in the ozone layer as an example, or knock out specific pollutants in the upper atmosphere, which from my perspective, as a matter of, of national interest, it certainly would seem that that would be one, if the story is true about ozone depletion being this big villain, we would certainly want to see develop. But unfortunately, that is not on the planning blocks for the military, although it is in the original patents. One of the other things Dr. Eastland pointed out was the idea that this instrument might be used for weather modification, actually changing weather patterns over a large geographic area. Now, since our original work was published, an additional paper was prepared by Dr. Eastland for the European Space Agency, which is the European equivalent to NASA. Now, that paper was to look at a HAARP-type instrument specifically for manipulating weather patterns. And he completed that work. They actually modeled this concept at the University of Oklahoma. And it's interesting, when they modeled it at the University of Oklahoma, do you remember a few years ago when the tornadoes whipped through that area? Created huge damage, and then President Clinton showed up on the scene, and one of the things he said at the University of Oklahoma was, "Don't worry, we're going to figure out a way to depress the energy in these tornadoes." And everyone kind of laughed it off. Well, 2 months before is when Bernard Eastland finished his modeling to do exactly that, and that was done for the European Space Agency. In fact, it was a very well received paper, and he's got a follow-on contract that just came in on that project. The idea that you can use this system for that kind of activity, for some people will say, well, wouldn't that be great to be able to knock out a tornado threatening a city? The problem is the energy has to go somewhere. It just doesn't disappear. Energy has to go somewhere. And the problem is you can't adequately model where that energy is going. And this is one of the big problems. When you think about ways in which HAARP can be used for weather modification, let me give you a couple of examples. One of them is when you, well, let me go back a little bit. The earlier versions of the HAARP instruments were called by the military ionospheric heaters, because they could heat up a portion of the ionosphere. And in so doing, an area, for instance, above HAARP can be heated about 30 miles in diameter. It then lifts up, because it's heated, it lifts up, and it can lift up, instead of being 30 miles above the Earth's surface, they can push it out to be a couple hundred miles above the Earth's surface within that area. All that lower atmosphere then moves in to fill that empty space. And when it does, it alters the pressure systems below. If there's a jet stream in the neighborhood, it has a tremendous impact on where that jet stream is going to go. In other words, it changes within our region of Alaska, over a very large area, a tremendous amount of weather. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the country? Well, if you watch the 6 o'clock news, you realize that a lot of weather originates in Alaska, having a profound effect on Canada and the United States. And what we know from our observations of El Nino and El Nina, that when you have weather, and those are big anomalies, those are huge anomalies, but when you have weather in one place, it has a profound effect around the planet. In fact, there's a principle in physics, and it's basically the butterfly effect, which is an old theory that goes, if a butterfly is flapping its wings in one part of the planet, it can create a hurricane in another. And the way this was done, figured out, was somebody made a very, very slight mathematical error in a computation. And as they compounded out the computation, it had a geometric effect. In other words, a small amount of energy at one point created a huge change in the outcome on the other. And this is how this was discovered, and then it's been proven in a number of laboratory settings that this theory, the butterfly effect, is actually quite real. The point is, what we know about weather modification, we can go back a little bit in history. In 1977, the United States, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and 60 other countries signed a treaty where we agreed not to use weather modification as a weapon of war. Now that's a long time ago. Now anyone who watched CNN today, and it's April in 2000, saw that we're just now seeing the or actually the Russians signing off on START 2, one of the disarmament treaties for nuclear weapons. A few years ago, we remember hearing about the sign-off on the chemical and biological, yet 23 years ago we signed off on geophysical manipulation and weather modification, because that's where the technology was then. It had advanced to the point where countries realized that if we moved forward in this area, we would have serious, serious consequences. One of the other things that came up with weather modification generally, there's a couple of things. I'll read a very short quote, and this kind of puts it in perspective. This is from Secretary of Defense William Cohen, who's our current Secretary of Defense, and he made this quote in April 1997 at the University of Georgia, and I quote, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climates, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. Now that's our current Secretary of Defense commenting on the state of the technology. And he's commenting on three areas: climate, earthquakes, and volcanoes using an electromagnetic system. In other words, not cloud seeding, not chemicals, not blasts causing faults to go, but electromagnetic waves. And he's accrediting terrorist organizations with this capability. Now in the context of our latest book, Earthrising the Revolution, we document very carefully. There's over 650 source documents that were quoted here, and each of them are footnoted. So when I make a statement, you can look at where it came from on the same page as it's written, and you can see where it came from. And most of our material is either U.S. patents, military records, academic studies, or mainstream media reports. And this material was derived from 80 boxes of archival material, reduced to 12, reduced to the 650 best sources to lay out our case. And when you think of weather mod, and you think about the fact that we're really just starting to gain an understanding of how these systems interact, and what they're finding is that underlying all these systems ultimately is energy. And as we talk tonight, we're going to be talking a lot about energy in terms of how it affects both human health and hardware or machinery. And when we think about physical matter, you can think about it in these terms: energy, atoms, molecules, chemicals and compounds, and eventually the physical manifestation of physical form. And that's pretty much the way it rolls. And what we're talking about is things that affect it at an energetic level, that have a roll-up effect through all living systems and non-living systems in terms of their composition and effect. What we're also finding is the interest in changing geophysical outcomes, in other words, what's happening in the planet naturally, by man-made means. And I really want to read a couple of verses that I think are relevant to put some of this into perspective. And I think it's important to put this in perspective. And I want to first go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 27. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And you know what it's really talking about? It goes on into 28. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And in those three verses, we find out who we are. We find out what our responsibility is, which is stewardship over this planet. And there's an important verse I'm going to read in a second, but before I get there, I want to read from chapter 2 in Genesis, verse 7, and it said, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." And what strikes me before I go to the next verse is that first we're created in the image of the Creator, which I think is phenomenal. I mean, that's phenomenal from my perspective. I think it should be from everyone's. But does that mean that the Creator, that God, looks like each one of us? I don't think so, because in the next chapter is where he then breathes life and man became a living soul. In other words, it kind of makes you wonder, what were we before? And I believe it's underneath that energy. We were something underneath that energy. Energy is something we measure in the physical world. Underneath that, I think, is where the real image, where the image of the Creator is. And when you go back and you go forward, and I like to go to the end and the beginning, you know, I'm kind of one of those people that reads the beginning and reads the end. But when you go through all of the stuff in the middle, it's sort of the story of how we sort of lost touch with who we are, you know, and what inheritance we really had. Christ had to come back and remind us. God had to actually show up and say, hey, let me get your attention here. Let me tell you what you really are and what your capabilities are. And then a lot of things started to happen. But then towards the end of the book, and this is really important, because you know, I deal with a lot of environmental organizations in the United States, and I have a lot of heartburn with a lot of these organizations because their agenda seems a little bit more than stewardship. In fact, a lot more than stewardship, and I don't agree with the rest of that agenda. But stewardship I agree with, and I think it's confirmed in chapter 11 of Revelations, verse 18, and it says, "And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come in the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward to thy servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, small and great, and should destroy them which destroy the earth." Sounds like there's a big price to pay if we don't pay attention. And we're talking about weather modification, man playing God. I think there's a big price to pay in the end. That's just before Armageddon and the rest of the bad news begins. And I think when we look at sort of the whole responsibility aspect of who we are, what our responsibility is, it really drives the point home that we can't ignore the place that we expect our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to live. By the same token, it's in balance with the fact that the earth is supposed to also serve us in the sense of providing for us. And God gave it to us for that reason. But let's talk about sort of what happens when man plays God in terms of weather. Some of the things that come out, and the idea and some of the things that have been pointed out, is the idea that man can modify the ionosphere, which has a direct effect on communications, also a direct effect on weather systems as we're learning. In fact, a few years ago, people remember that above lightning storms, there was this energy that went up, and they were called sprites, and this energy had never been known before. And they still can't figure out exactly what role it plays in our weather systems. But what is being found out is that it's under all of this, that if you affect the energy of the system, you can have profound effects throughout the system. And again, this becomes somewhat problematic. Let's talk about the Earth-penetrating tomography aspect in line with the thing I just read from Secretary of Defense Cohen. The idea that you could trigger an earthquake, how would that work? This is kind of interesting. There was a friend of ours, Brooks Agnew. He's a really good guy in Earth-penetrating tomography. And what he found using 30 watts of energy, about half the energy that you have in a household light bulb, using 30 watts of energy, he was able to send that energy into the earth by hitting the resonant frequency, that frequency that harmonized with the natural energy of the earth. And what it allowed is for that energy to go into the earth several kilometers deep, and a certain amount of it gets reflected back. And that reflected energy is what gets measured to determine what's under the ground. This is how earth-penetrating tomography works. But if you crank the volume up, the amount of energy going in, he believes, and I believe it's borne out by the research that we've done, that you can trigger a release of energy in a nonlinear way. Now, let me give you an example of what that means. Let's say from here to Paris, we stacked up dominoes, starting with a regular domino, and we increased their size by 1% from here to Paris. So by the time it gets to Paris, you got a domino about the size of the Eiffel Tower. Now, if we hit the first one with a ½ an ounce weight, eventually they all tumble over, and the one that's in Paris crushes the Eiffel Tower. Now, it's not the ½ ounce weight. It was the ½ ounce weight that triggered the event that capitalized on gravitational energy, energy that was already there. It just acted like the primer on a bullet, releasing that energy. What's been found out about HAARP is the same thing can occur in the upper ionosphere. In fact, if you broadcast energy in the very low frequency range, that energy, when it hits the top of the ionosphere, where the next layer begins, it actually amplifies by up to 1,000 times. Now that's tremendous, because HAARP, when it finishes its first stage, will have an effective radiated power of 1 billion watts, according to the military record. 1 billion watts. Now imagine that being amplified by 1,000 times, or whatever portion of that energy you could actually deliver into that upper portion of the ionosphere. Tremendous nonlinear effects would then be possible. The kinds of effects that could trigger these geophysical events that we're reading about. Now, the other part that comes in is you can go back a little bit further. There was a gentleman by the name of J.F. Gordon MacDonald. He wrote a chapter in a book called Unless Peace Comes. The chapter was How to Wreck Your Environment. This was written in 1969. That was before the environmental movement, because it would have probably been unpopular, and it was quite a popular book at the time. But he was a geophysicist at UCLA, and he was also an advisor, a science advisor to President Lyndon Johnson when he was in the presidency. And what he suggested was all of these things were possible if we could ever figure out the triggering mechanisms. And those triggering mechanisms are exactly the state of the technology today. We have figured out how to trigger these kinds of events utilizing electromagnetic means. Going a little bit further, one of the other things that J.F. Gordon MacDonald talked about, and one of the other potential uses for HAARP, deals with the impact on the human body and the human mind. And one of the things that we know from the research is extremely low frequency, which is where the brain predominantly operates, can be influenced by external signals. And let me describe some of the background of this, because this is a big part of our current work, and this is going to move us off of the old stuff and onto the new. What we know, and this is again go to J.F. Gordon MacDonald, the science advisor to Johnson, he also said that if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way as to return a signal in the ELF range, extremely low frequency range, we could manipulate the behavior of humans over a large geographic area. But it didn't end with him. In 1971, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages, which is actually, if you read it today, you'd swear it was a history and not a forecast, because it forecasted what would happen in the third world in terms of development. It forecasted the collapse of the former Soviet Union. It forecast the advancement of technologies in terms of how they would affect our economies globally, the change from rural economies to urban economies. All those things were laid out. For those that don't remember, or maybe too young to remember, Zbigniew Brzezinski, that was when he was at Columbia University. He later became National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter when he was president. So he wasn't any slouch. I mean, this guy knew. But on page 54 through 56 of that book, you'll find references to this idea of electronically stroking the ionosphere in just the right way as to manipulate the behavior of human beings over a large geographic area. Now, we can talk a little bit about that because I think it's a real relevant point. I won't go to the quote because it'll take too much time, but there's another quote in the book talking about the use of this very kind of system in 1978, bombarding a signal back into the Soviet Union or the former satellite states to affect the behavior of people operating nuclear power plants, as an example. It's kind of interesting. Shows up in the literature. But let's go back in time a little bit to talk about this whole concept of can you really modify the behavior of human beings? And let's first talk about the science itself. What we know about human brain waves, if you've ever seen an EEG, which gives a little chart, they hook up the electrodes to the head and they produce a little chart and you'll see a little squiggly line. Well, it's measuring your brain rhythms, your predominant brain frequencies. What it's found in that, and in the study of what happens within the human brain, and I'm going to break it down into a few components. I'm going to talk about sort of the good side of this and then the bad news. What happens when you're in deep, deep sleep, your brain activity is operating between 1 and 4 pulses per second. That's when you're in the deepest form of sleep, when you're knocked out cold. The next stage is theta stage, which is between 4 and 7 hertz approximately, pulses per second, cycles per second. I'll use those words interchangeably. But essentially pulses per second. This is the frequency in which most little kids between 3 and 5 years old, this is their predominant brainwave activity. If you think about little kids, they're kind of in a half awake, half asleep sort of place. This is the same place adults are when you're half awake and half asleep, sort of drifting in and out of your dream state, but you're aware. This is where these guys are all the time, which kind of explains why they're sort of half there and half not, and it's hard to get their attention sometimes. But it's also the time when they're learning a tremendous amount. They learn language, social customs. I mean, think about all the things kids learn between 3 and 5. It's pretty phenomenal. But that's where they are until we send them to school and we start messing them up in the public system and dampening that creative talent and spirit that they have. By the time they get out of school, there's about 1% of the population that has any creative capacity of any consequence left, unless you're fortunate enough to recapture it somewhere along the line. It's not very easy to do. But going above that, from say 7 hertz to around 12 hertz, you're in what's called an alpha state. This is a highly creative state. This is where most artists are when they're doing their really good work, when athletes are sort of in the groove, on step. This is the place where things just sort of flow really well. It's interesting to note, there's a gentleman, a German scientist in the 50s, discovered the resonant frequency of the Earth, what the Earth naturally pulses at, and it's 7.83 hertz, which is kind of interesting. It's called Schumann's resonance. What's interesting about that is it correlates to this highly creative state in human beings. Very interesting. But going above that, above 12 hertz, say 12 to 20 hertz is a beta state, which most of us are in. That's where we are right now, unless I put you to sleep, then you're dropping down a little bit. But that's where we generally are, and that's kind of active thinking, active listening. If it gets too high, that's when you get agitated, angry. If you get it real high, you're totally out of control. Now, another important couple factors about the brain that's important to note in terms of brain frequency is when you experience positive emotions, love, joy, happiness, your brain waves are very coherent, very rhythmic, very controlled in that sense. If you're in fear, hate, anger, they're all over the map, which means you cannot make good decisions unless you make them by mistake. Chances are you're not going to make good decisions because that is not the way the brain works. Now, what's interesting when you think about what happens when you're in fear and where fear comes from. It makes a lot of sense in terms of science when you look at it, and in terms of religion when you look at it. Because these things operate under the rules that God created, and they work. Now, at the same time, there's an idea of when 2 or more are gathered in His name, right? Really powerful things happen. You know that when you center around the emotion of love, and 2 people look in each other's eyes, which whatever form of love it is, and they focus on each other's eyes, that their brain waves become synchronized. It's very interesting, and this can be actually measured with an EEG. When they become synchronized in resonance, resonance is a formula that goes x plus x squared. In other words, it's more than the sum of the total. Again, it makes perfect sense. Lines right up, science lines right up with what's right here. Now, those are outward manifestations of what happens. Now, if you can interfere with brain activity by external sources of energy, then you can have a tremendous impact on human thinking and emotion. Now, what we have found, and science has found, and I'm going to go back to the work of a gentleman by the name of Jose Delgado, who many of you have probably heard about. Now, Jose Delgado got his degree in electrophysiology from the University of Madrid in 1950. Most people don't even know a degree in electrophysiology exists, much less 50 years ago. But when he finished his work there, he came to the United States. He ended up working at Yale University for almost 30 years. In the 60s, he wrote a book called Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. That's kind of an interesting concept. His basic idea was that if we could manipulate the brain activity of human beings, we could basically put us all in this sort of happy, blissful sort of existence. Now, from my perspective, that really violates the very essence of who we are as human beings, because who we are as human beings requires free will, which means we have to be able to freely express our emotions. And anything that interferes with that is something that even God will not do, not just by Christian tradition, but by most major religious traditions. That's what distinguishes us from other creatures. We are the ones with free will, the way to make choices. Now, what Delgado believed and what he tested was, first of all, to map out the brain to see what's going on in the brain. He began implanting electrodes and then stimulating them with electricity to see what would happen. He did that up until the late 60s, even into the 70s. And one of the things he did to sort of demonstrate how powerful this was utilizing these implants in a radio frequency transmitter that kicked the energy in. He had a charging bull coming at him, and then he flipped the switch and it stopped, dead in its tracks, a few feet from him. Now you can see the photograph of it in the book I just referenced, Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. It's kind of interesting. But he continued to work in this area, and he found by mid-1985 that he didn't need to use implants. He didn't even need to use any really high-energy devices. What he found is that energy at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces. This is very minute energy. But if you think about the human body, we run on very minute energy when you think about what's going through our nervous system, what's happening within the brain. But at 1/50th, hitting the right frequency, he could change the behavior of humans and primates, monkeys and humans, like turning on and off a light switch from passive to highly aggressive and back. Now, he did this using a pulsed radio frequency signal, which is the stuff of HAARP on the broad scale. On a smaller scale, it was his little lab device. Now, Delgado got pretty excited about it. The military got pretty excited about it. There's a whole series of things that came out of that. The mind control section of our book actually covers almost 30 patents, U.S. patents, that show the evolution of this technology. It covers the military records showing sort of how they saw this technology evolving. And then in addition to that, the academic reports that show the results of testing and experimenting in this field. And then, in some instances, congressional reports condemning its use. Because one of the things that came out in the early 70s, and this was one of those things that kind of struck me. I mean, when we were doing our work, you know, sometimes when you're digging out material, and we dig out a tremendous amount of material, but every once in a while you hit a tough spot where you can't find that thing that you know is out there. And one of these was a project called MK Ultra, which was a CIA project for mind control purposes. It was being developed back in the 60s and 70s. And we heard references in the literature, but never saw that primary document. And this is kind of the way a lot of our research worked. I'm sitting in a book room, a big surplus book room, and I'm talking to this guy, and I'm really frustrated because I want a primary document. I don't want a secondary or a tertiary document. I want something that's right to the heart that no one can argue with. So I'm sitting there and I'm talking to him about this problem. I wanted to find out something that would be primary. And I reach in a box of books, and as I'm telling him this story, I pull out a book, and it's a congressional investigation on the CIA, and inside it is exactly what I was looking for. Now, I give that as an example because it happened all the time, and it still does. I mean, when we need something, if it's relevant to our work, it sort of shows up in the most bizarre ways. And it's kind of a neat thing, you know when you're on the right track when that starts happening, and it happens a lot. Well, the point was, the CIA, during that time, had done a lot of things. CIA, you got to remember, is not supposed to do anything domestic. You know, they're supposed to be out of the country. Well, that's bogus, I can tell you. What they were doing, at that time, they were opening mail. They were infiltrating civil rights groups, anti-war groups. They were also involved in a project, MK Ultra, where they were actually using chemicals such as LSD and other hallucinogenics to influence behavior of people. And they were interested in this because when people came out of the Korean War, kids came back that had been prisoners of war that were just acting really bizarre. And this is when the term brainwashing was first created, and this interest in all of this started. Now, what came out of all that, as you roll up through their work, mainly what came out of the congressional record was strictly chemicals, LSD, hallucinogenics. I mean, in one instance, 8,000 service personnel were given LSD to see what would happen. You know, I mean, think about this. You know, this is our government with people already charged with being responsible to defend us in the event of war, and we're getting them stoned on LSD to see what would happen. Now, the idea, they thought, was if we could figure out how to modify behavior, maybe we could eliminate fear, you know, so when people go into combat, they wouldn't be afraid. Maybe we could enhance capacity or limit the capacity of an adversary. And this was their big thrust. But everyone thought, as they went through this, and thousands of records were shredded at the time, people responsible for that got in a lot of trouble not enough trouble from my perspective. But the fact of the matter was, the real meat of the issue, we always believed, and recently, and we show it in the book, we found that it was in fact true. Electromagnetic means were also being experimented with as far back as 1960. This is a long time ago, 40 years ago, a generation ago. And in that, what we found is through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, that there was a large body of data surrounding this. And then when we started looking at the patent record for what had evolved between 1960s and the current time, we found all of these things, not just for behavior, which is emotional state, but we found that utilizing very little energy, according to Delgado's work and a number of patents, that you could in fact move the emotional state of human beings. Now when you go a little bit further, the idea comes in, well, what else could you do if you could manipulate this energy, and what other forms could you use to do this? Now one of the things that many people will remember, a couple of years ago there was a cartoon in Japan, Pokemon was being played, and 700 kids had epileptic seizures from seeing the flashing light on the cartoon. Now, I want to explain this principle because it's a very important principle for understanding how energy systems, energy weapons work. When you take a carrier, and let me explain this, let's look at a couple of analogies. First of all, let's consider the modulation, that pulse rate that was carried in that cartoon. Let's call that the information. Now that information you can put, say, in a box and put it on a train, plane, or automobile, and the information's still the same, still arrives at the same destination. You open the box and there's the information. In terms of electromagnetic carriers, we can use flashing light, we can use a television, we can use a radio, we can use anything that carries an electromagnetic signal, even the current flowing around this room. If we can modulate, vibrate, pulse that energy in the right way, that's the information. That's what's in the little box. So you can carry it in a number of ways. In fact, I'll give you a couple of examples right out of some literature that's pretty interesting. This came out of an article that was in a magazine, or actually a publication by the U.S. Army War College, and then also out of a publication from one of the Russian Army leading journals called Orienteer. And I'll just read a couple of these just to give you a sort of a flavor for what I'm talking about. A psychotronic generator which produces a powerful electromagnetic emanation capable of being sent through telephone lines, TV, radio networks, supply pipes, and incandescent lamps. This signal would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal. Another one, a nervous system generator which is designed to paralyze the central nervous system of insects. The same system is being refined to have the same effect on human beings. Another one, and this one's kind of interesting, ultrasonic signals of very specific design have been created. These devices are supposedly capable of carrying out bloodless internal operations without leaving a mark on the skin. And they can also be used to kill. And another one, and this is a real interesting one, the 25th frame effect is a technique where every 25th frame of a movie reel or video footage contains a message that is picked up by the subconscious so as to alter the conscious mind. That same 25th frame effect can be instilled through computer networks and delivered via the internet. Now you're worrying about pornography, good thing to worry about. Worry about some of the other technologies in terms of that carrier. Because when you think about the internet as an unregulated, unfiltered source of information, the 25th frame effect, this idea of carrying signals on internet transmissions, is very, very possible. Technology exists to do it, and we cite a number of patents that point that out quite clearly. In terms of radio, like radio broadcasts that you hear, you know, back during the Gulf War, we suspected for a long time that something else was going on there beyond the conventional weaponry. And the thing is, as our sort of rule of thumb, in fact it is our rule of thumb, if you can't prove it and you can't produce documents to prove it, you just don't say it. Because there's plenty out there. If there's 100 items in the plate and 80 of them you can prove, stick to the 80. The other 20, either time will prove are not correct or time will give you the information that evidences them. And this is very important because when we go out and we talk about this, we need to be equipped to deliver that source material. The people we tell need to be equipped, so when they're challenged by people with more technical backgrounds or scientific backgrounds or political backgrounds, that they can point authoritatively to those sources and say, it's not my words, it's your words, and point to those military records, point to those U.S. patents, point to those academic studies that lay out that case. Because I think that's equipping people properly. And it also serves to dissipate a lot of the fear when you replace fear with real knowledge, and then you act on that knowledge in a responsible way. That's a very important thing, because fear, I think, really comes from the wrong place. You know, I mean, it's not a matter of generating fear, it's a matter of generating hope. I mean, the purpose of prophecy is to warn us. It's not to condemn us, it's to warn us about what might be coming, but at the same time, to sort of say, look, if, you know, you change your behavior, you change what you're doing, maybe the time won't come tomorrow, maybe it'll be put off. And I can say that, you know, I think pretty confidently that for the last 2,000 years, people have been saying, this is it, it's all over. And we're still here 2,000 years later. Maybe this is it, maybe it is all over, but the fact of the matter is, we're not called to hide in a hole, we're called to step out and act on what we know to be right and true. The other thing that's important, when we talk about mind control technologies, when you talk about something that's influencing behavior, that's one thing, and that's certainly interfering with free will. But let's take it another step. And an important part of this is as it relates to the HAARP activity, and I've got to tell you this story. This is a great story. People always underestimate, you know, what our own potentials are. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. Somebody heard us on the radio one time, heard what we were saying, got hold of one of our books, read it, and sent it to a friend of theirs. Well, their friend turned out to be the chairman of the environmental subcommittee of the European Parliament. And he read it, and he went, you know, this sounds pretty bizarre to me, and kind of reacted like I reacted the first time, but he did what I did. He went and checked it out, checked with his scientists, went to his military. This guy, Tom Spencer, goes to his military in Great Britain. He was a conservative from Great Britain. And he says, what's the story on this HAARP project? And they said, look, you really don't want to get involved in this. You know, stay out of it. It's, you know, you just don't want to go there. And for Tom Spencer, that was the ticket to the dance. You know, that was his invitation to get engaged. So he dug around, we went over and saw him. In fact, we made 4 or 5 visits to him. And then at one point, and that's too long of a story to tell, at one point we ended up on a ship together for 12 days. And in that time, we sort of laid out a plan of how do we take this information into a political body so that we can address it. And more than that, beyond HAARP, we wanted to deal with these other weapon technologies which we felt were even more dangerous and more invasive, things that can influence our very behavior. As a result, he invited us, well, I got to go back a little bit. In the course of all of this, he got a new assignment. He became the Foreign Affairs Chairman, which is a very powerful position in the European Parliament. And so he decided that he would have a hearing in one of his subcommittees to address HAARP and broaden the agenda to include non-lethal weapons, such as the things we've been talking about so far today. And in that, he invited NATO. He went to the Secretary General of NATO. Now, this is the same committee that NATO went to when they wanted to introduce new member states to NATO. So they were a very important committee when NATO needed them. Now they go to the Secretary General and say, well, we'd like you to produce somebody to talk about ionospheric modification for weapons application, the stuff of HAARP, and we'd like you to talk about non-lethal weapons, the stuff of mind control and the like. And NATO says, we don't have a policy on either, and we're not going to appear. So Tom doesn't stop there because he's a very persistent guy. He goes to the American mission, our embassy in Brussels, and says, look, we want you to produce somebody to talk about your project, HAARP, and these other issues. And they wouldn't produce anyone. So he brought me in. He brought in someone from the International Red Cross, someone from Canada who is a physicist and an MD. In fact, this woman, Rosalie Bertel, was also a nun, and I don't know which order she was in. So you know, kind of a strange combination. You had a physicist, an MD, and a nun all in one body. And she was really good, and she was also the lead physician to investigate Bhopal after that huge event happened out there. So a very credible person. And then he brought in also someone from a group called GRIP, which was a group that deals with weapon systems based in Brussels. And what we did, and this is kind of interesting, the Europeans have a little different way of doing things. You know, we had delivered over those several visits hundreds and hundreds of documents, about 3 feet of documents we had delivered to the Europeans. And these are our allies, basically. So they had a lot of background material, they had a lot of information, and they were so incensed that the military would not show up, that NATO wouldn't show up, and the U.S. wouldn't produce anyone. They really wanted to have a good, solid hearing, and they were going to have it anyway. And so we met the night before. They shut down a restaurant, put us in there, 2 people from the media that they trusted, the committee members, and myself, and we went through our evidence for 5.5 hours. So they would be able to frame their questions in the public record the next day adequately to bring this issue out. So we went in, and the first thing we presented was a NATO document from NATO France on ionospheric modification for weapons application, the thing they didn't have any policy about, right? The other thing we brought in was something from the Strategic Studies Institute showing where NATO had deployed non-lethal weapons in events and conflicts in Europe. So we take in their own documents, essentially. The Strategic Studies Institute is independent, but they're considered one of the most credible in the world. And their document from NATO France, one of the lead guys credited in that, was also attached to the HARP program. So the idea that they didn't have a policy, we said, look, if they don't have a policy on these things, and what are they doing? Deploying these systems and experimenting with them, it seems pretty reckless to us. Well, instead of the 15 minutes we were supposed to have, I had an hour and a half to present our case. The other thing we did as part of our presentation is we demonstrated an infrasound device. Now this is a device, and I'll explain how this works because it's going to get right into the next phase of this thing. An infrasound device is a device that converts sound information into a carrier that can transfer through the nervous system and arrive at the brain in the same way that a sound wave normally would. But this is the difference. A sound wave hits the outer ear, and this is your antenna array, this ear. If you close your eyes and someone jingles keys and walks around the room, within a few degrees you can isolate, where they are. But if you distort this and try it, you won't be able to isolate where they are because this is what's catching that first sound wave, is giving some direction. Then hits the eardrum, vibrates the eardrum slightly. There's 3 small bones in the inner ear. Those get vibrated slightly. There's a little bit of fluid that vibrates, and then it hits what's called the 8th cranial nerve. And what goes through the 8th cranial nerve is a little electrical signal that's digitized by that point because of all this activity on the outer ear. And that digital signal arrives at the brain through that nerve. The brain, they believe now, operates holographically. It picks out that code, that modulation, that little package of information, and you perceive sound. My voice, for instance, that you're hearing now. Now, if you can duplicate that modulation, that little package of information, and carry it in another way, and connect it to the nervous system, you'll hear the sound too, but it won't have any directional orientation. Now, the device we took did this. It used a piezoelectric transducer, which is a little disc that fits on the skin. It connects up, couples to the nervous system, and actually transfers the signal. So you can completely block your outer ears, and what you hear is a signal as if it were originating in the center of your head, inside your cranium. So that's where the sound originated, and you would be hearing my voice just as clear as you're hearing it now. Now, when we demonstrated this in infrasound devices, we're sort of in the literature, but these guys had never seen one. This was built out of stuff off the shelf, literally from a Radio Shack, and demonstrated that this capability existed. And the patent it was based on goes back to 1958. Now, when we showed them that got us this really important resolution passed because we wanted to get the stuff in on HARP, and they gave us that. But then the main thing we wanted to make sure we had something that would stretch it into these more important, from our perspective, very much more important technologies. And this is what that portion of the resolution says. It calls for an international convention introducing a global ban on all developments and deployments of weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings, unquote. Very important, in the sense that here's a political body that finally recognized technology exists. And when you think about how do countries get influenced, how do organizations get influenced, rule 1, you preempt the leadership. You take out the leadership, right? I mean, if you want to stop a movement, you go after the people at the top, and everything sort of falls away. Well, when parliamentarians sort of think about, what would be the effect of this system on me? I mean, ask yourself, if one of your favorite parliamentarians or legislators stood up and started talking about hearing voices in their head, sayonara, you're out of here. You wouldn't tolerate it. They'd be gone, right? At the same time, if they didn't say anything and they just were experiencing it, wouldn't it be highly disturbing? In fact, I want to go to a military document. It's New World Vistas, Air and Space for the 21st Century. And it's put out by the Scientific Advisory Board to the Air Force. And if I can quickly find the quote, I'll read it, because it really lays out sort of another angle to this discussion that I think is quite compelling, if I'm fortunate enough to find it when I need it. Yeah, here it is. Again, this is an Air Force document. and this is the quote, "It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body, raising the possibility of covert suggestion and psychological direction. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion which would be most disturbing to them," unquote. Now, wouldn't that be most disturbing if you were walking around and all of a sudden you got that voice in the head? And what's interesting is I was on a program, it was called Undercurrents. It's on CBC, Canadian Broadcasting System, one of their highest rated shows in Canada. That's their public broadcaster. And we did a special with a number of experts on mind control. And one of the experts was a guy named Smirnov, who works in the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he demonstrated this very same technology, utilizing a medium that could be easily pushed through the internet. And what he said was that when you hear this, it's like hearing the voice of God. It cannot be resisted. Now, why is that? It's because it bypasses the conscious portion of the brain that filters out right and wrong, good and evil, lines things up with our experience, sort of dumps it straight into the brain where you begin to act on it. You're compelled to act on it. Now, Smirnov wasn't alone in that presentation. The other people that talked about this was a couple, I forget their first names, the Morrises. Now, they worked with a guy named D. Klein and a guy named John Alexander during the Bush-Reagan era, and evolved this whole concept of non-lethals. Now, they couldn't talk about what they did in the United States, but they had a chance to test this little device when they were on a trip to Moscow, and they testified in this tape and in a number of other sources that are quoted within the book about their experience that, in fact, it really does work, that you literally cannot resist it. And the way it was demonstrated for them was they ran it through the building that they were in, and what they told everyone to do was to bring at an appointed time little cakes, down to this office. Now, when you drink coffee or tea in Russia, it usually goes with little cakes. So at the appointed time, all these people from all over the place show up at the little cakes, as a demonstration. Well, the interesting part of all of it is that the idea of transferring voice information in this way is quite compelling. More than that, it goes even further, because what we used, you had to have a physical connection. What we know is that through microwaves or other carriers, you can carry that same signal in. If we had had a little more time and maybe 20 or 30,000 to play with that, we could have demonstrated that as well. And someday we probably will, because it's very compelling when you can show someone how it really works. It changes the whole perspective. And when you think about hierarchical structures, organizations, they tend to be, you take out the top and everything falls apart. The thing the military fears the most, the thing that most disturbs them in terms of outcomes, is what's called a leaderless revolution. And this is really sort of the subhead of all of this. What is a leaderless revolution? It's one without a head and one without a tail. You can't really stop it. It's when spontaneously a block of people get the same spiritual inclination and begin moving a certain direction, and things start changing. Like what we couldn't do in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries in 40 years. All of a sudden, everybody kind of was in the streets. It was relatively nonviolent. It wasn't a violent thing. There wasn't any leadership to throw in jail. And what happened? What we couldn't do in 40 years, the whole thing collapsed in a matter of weeks and months. Because leaderless revolution, you couldn't isolate the leadership and get them out of circulation. The other thing that's important is what actually happened in that instance, or the instances in the Philippines when Marcos went down. The same kind of thing occurred. All of a sudden, spontaneously, people acted because they did a very simple thing. Faith, when I was growing up, and I can tell you, my route to become a Christian was not an easy trail, because the way my mind works, the way I think, wasn't an easy trail. It's too long to explain here, but I can tell you it was a tough one, all right? Because I had to have proofs and evidence and all this stuff, because that's my nature. But the point is, what was sort of the break point? I was raised originally a Catholic, and at the point of confirmation, this is where you're supposed to know that you know. Well, I didn't know, and I told the priest I didn't know at that point in my life, and I wasn't going to do it. And there aren't a lot of Catholics that do that, They kind of say, wait a minute, I don't want to do this because I'm not going to lie to myself, first of all, and then lie to you, second of all. And that was where I was at 12 years old. But what that priest told me that was interesting, he said, he tried to get in this long discussion about what faith was, which was really confused the heck out of me. Because for me, what I have learned is faith is a very simple thing. It's not a very complex thing. Faith is acting on what you know to be right and true and stepping into it. Sitting on the bench, warm in the pew with no action, nothing is happening there. Faith is demonstrated by stepping into the game and doing something about what you know to be right and true, and not with a lot of anxiety and tension and all that, because God doesn't give us things that we can't handle. It's with pure confidence that you know that by making that step in that direction, that you'll get what you need to do what you need to do in terms of your work. Whether it's something as complicated as what this all might appear to be, or something quite simple. And there's a human butterfly effect. You know, that butterfly effect, a little bit of energy in, huge things out. You never know what it's going to do. You might be walking down the street someday, and it may be as simple as smiling at the guy walking the other direction, and that simple thing might actually change that individual's life. Maybe they didn't think anybody cared about them, and maybe that little simple thing could have that profound effect. And I believe that. And I'll give you another example. Remember that person heard us on the radio, decided to do something with the information, stepped in to the game, and look what came out of it. Tremendous thing. I mean, I never would have expected. Somebody told me I'd be standing here today and have followed the trail I've followed in the last 7 years. I'd have said, you're out of your mind, you know, because it just doesn't look that way when you start down that trail. But every time you take one of those steps, eventually you look back behind you, there's a whole trail, and you go, wow, I couldn't have mapped that one out any better if I had tried. And you didn't. And I think that's it. It's a step of faith. You know, the faith of a mustard seed, a real small thing, creates a real big thing. It's the same idea here. You got to do something. You got to act some action to it and recognize where that real truth lies. Along that line, you know, when we look back, there's a couple other things that are kind of other examples of it. There was a guy that wrote me from Germany. He worked in a mail room, you know, a mail room in the bottom of a big business. And he wrote me a letter and he said, you know, I really liked your book because he saw it, he read it in the Munich library. He goes, what can I do to help you? And I said, I really need a German publisher because Germans are real important for these issues in Europe. So this guy thinks about who's the best publisher in Germany for our book. Now he takes up his copy, which was kind of marked up sort of like mine, and chases somebody, figures out who it is in this bureaucracy and sends his copy of the book over and follows up with the phone call, chases the guy down and says, you know, will you read it at least? And he goes, yeah, I'll read it in the next couple months. I'll get back to you. 3 days later, the guy called me. 5 days later, we had an agreement. The next day after the agreement, he had 5 translators on the book and an MD, and it was in print and available in Germany 3 months later, which anyone who knows anything about publishing, that's a phenomenal pace to translate a technical title. The same thing happened. We wanted Japan. You know, you get Germany, Japan, and the US. You can really kind of cover big chunks of what happens to influence policy. In Japan, it was interesting. There's a guy, he's a mortician in California, read our book. Send it to somebody he knew. Same thing happened. We ended up with our book in Japanese. I can give you dozens of examples like that because we always underestimate what we're all capable of. It takes a step. May not be this issue. Might be something else. Everyone in this room has something near and dear to your heart that requires some little bit of action. And in doing so, tremendous things can become possible. In looking at sort of where does it go from there, one of the other things that shows up in New World Vistas, Air and Space for the 21st Century is sort of the ultimate on where mind technologies may someday go and may very shortly go, is the idea of being able to remove a memory and give you a new one, a synthetic memory. Now, from a military perspective, this would be great for training, right? Instead of learning all this stuff for weeks and months, it'd be nice to just download that information. We are not that far off. The problem there is, from my perspective, it may sound real interesting. I mean, what if you could learn a foreign language in a few hours? That might be kind of exciting. Here's something to think about. And I don't know whether Stan mentioned it when he introduced me, but I also was past president of the Alaska Federation of Teachers for 2 terms and the Anchorage Council of Education for 2 terms, teachers organizations. I'm the only teachers organization president that I know about that ever served in that capacity that favors vouchers. Now, why would I favor vouchers? Because I'm smart enough to know that what the public system is doing, what the state does to download into our kids with the current curriculum is somewhat damaging, severely damaging in some cases. But the idea that the state knows better than the parent, I have a real hard problem with. But the other aspect of it is military technology eventually translates into private sector. Now think about this as an educational tool. Who will control the curriculum if this type of technology migrates into the private sector? Who will decide for that first 16 years where children are required to be educated and most people can't afford private education or homeschooling. They can't do it because they're working 3 jobs to make 1 living already. Who's going to control the curriculum that goes into kids' heads? Bearing in mind that when you dump information in utilizing these tools, you bypass the conscious filter, what's right and wrong. So what you establish is the moral base under which the country operates. Very dangerous technology. We cannot wait until it's here. We need to deal with the technologies now. Now that's one area. You know, we've covered quite a bit, but we've covered very little in terms of what's in this title. I want to jump to some other subjects because otherwise we're not going to get very much covered. Let's talk about sort of where some of the other technology goes, and I want to talk a little bit about going back to sort of energy weapons and the bigger concepts of weaponry, because this whole concept is wrapped around the idea of a revolution in military affairs. Now, this is the military's concept. It was first raised in a document by the same name by the U.S. Army War College. And what they talked about, this is back in 1990, the revolution in military affairs was a change in the context in which war would be fought that was so profound, they equated it to the development of atomic weapons earlier this century or the introduction of gunpowder to Europe in the Middle Ages. In other words, it would change the very face of warfare. And this concept is centered around the idea of electromagnetic warfare, the use of electromagnetic fields to affect hardware and software, living organisms, in an adverse way. One of the things that jumps out, and we've heard little bits and pieces, and you know the thing about a lot of this is people go, well, I remember that, or I remember this, and over the course of time we remember lots of it, but when it comes out over 40 years, a slice at a time, it doesn't have the same effect. It's the old story, you know, you throw a frog in a pot of water and you turn the heat up, and as it boils, he just sits there until he boils to death. But if you throw him into a pot of boiling water, he's going to jump out. This is the pot of boiling water. Because when you see it in one place, you go, wait a minute, it's gone way too far, it's time for a change. And this is, again, sort of where does it go? Well, electromagnetic warfare, we talked about weather modification, we talked about effects on human beings, but there's some new weaponry. And one of the things that came out, if anyone watched CNN today, they saw this thing about START 2 getting signed off by the Duma, the lower house of the Russian parliament. And START 2, one thing they said, though, today that was really interesting is that they'll agree to that, but they will not agree to a modification of the ABM Treaty from 1972. This is a treaty that requires that each country can only have one defense system against nuclear attack. Okay? Now, the important thing here is when I go back to that hearing I testified at in the European Parliament, I said to the parliamentarians back in 98, early 98, I said, the United States will unilaterally scuttle the ABM Treaty. And they'll do it on the rationale that there is no Soviet Union and therefore there is no treaty. Now, when I got done with our whole presentation, that was the one point parliamentarians came after me on. They said, there's just no way. We're their allies. They're not going to do that without telling us. And I said, you have 18 to 24 months and it's going to happen. You need to act on these issues now. I was wrong. It took 9 months. Because in the Federal Register, and we covered in the book, the U.S. announced that we were going to deploy a new missile defense system. In fact, we've already spent $6.6 billion developing it. And this system would be deployed in Alaska, which is what we said. And more than that, we said that the argument that would be used, this is exactly what our senior Senator Ted Stevens, who chairs the United States Senate Appropriation Committee, the most powerful appropriation committee is. I mean, it gives out the money. It determines the budget for the greatest part. He said there is no Soviet Union, therefore there is no agreement. Now, needless to say, that agitated the Russians, that agitated the Chinese, and agitated our allies, and we traced the history in the book of where everybody ran around to try and smooth it over. But today, as recently as today, it comes up again in the mainstream media, as this is one point the Russians will not give on. And to demonstrate it, most of you probably didn't connect it all, but they actually fired off of one of their nuclear submarines a missile back into their own country to demonstrate they still had that capability, because what is clearly known is a shield generally is thought to not be possible to work at all for a submarine that's close in U.S. waters launching, because there's no time to fire up the system. Now, what they're also doing, and they're talking about, and I can tell you it's bogus, is they're talking about the idea of using ground-to-air missiles to intercept these ICBMs, these intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, think about this. You stand on one side of the room and I'll stand on the other, and we'll both shoot a bullet and we'll see if we can hit the bullets, okay? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about hitting a bullet with a bullet. One of the leading scientists on this just a few weeks ago came out public and said it won't work, and the tests that they've run have been manipulated to give good results, and this will not work. And from a cover story standpoint, it's an interesting story, but there's some better technologies out there. In fact, this is really interesting because, you know, when you read things at the first blush and you go, wait a minute, is that really there? And here's one that comes from the Department of Energy. And you got to remember, the United States Department of Energy used to be the Atomic Energy Commission. You know, the guys that brought us to Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. So you got to kind of think about it in this context. These guys own this technology from 1990, and it's U.S. patent number 4959559. And I'll just read you one line out of it because it's really compelling, then I'll explain what the heck it says. It says, the invention relates generally to the transmission of pulses of energy, and more particularly the propagation of localized pulses of electromagnetic or acoustic energy over long distances without divergence. Now, what does that mean? Without divergence is the idea that normally when you think about that kind of energy, you think about it spreading out, becoming very, very less concentrated the further it goes. Now they figure out a way to keep it all together. Now, when you think about this, what's important, and then I'm not going to read the next section, I'll just tell you what it says. In the next section of the patent, it's a U.S. government patent, they equate this to a photon torpedo right out of Star Trek, right? You know that little blob of energy that shoots across? Okay, that's what they compare it to. It's really interesting, except the difference is when you shoot a blob of energy through the atmosphere, it's traveling at about 186,300 miles per second. That's the speed of light. This is traveling maybe just slightly below the speed of light, as opposed to 30,000 miles an hour, which is the speed of ICBM. So the idea of hitting a bullet with a blob of energy is much more realistic because you can get several off, you can triangulate the position, period. That's the type of technology we're going to see. We hear about lasers, because lasers are speed of light weapons. You know, that's what they are. There's a light beam. It's going at the speed of light, 186,300 miles per second. Zing. But you got to get a lot of energy. And they haven't been able to quite figure that out with lasers yet. There are some big ones, but they weigh a lot. They're not the kind of things you can put in a satellite. They're not the kind of things you can easily put on the ground. This type of technology is the other half of the ICBM shield system that we'll eventually see deployed, because the other is strictly a ruse. When you look at the press reports and we cite them of what the Chinese were saying, they started talking energy weapons as soon as we started talking about unilaterally scuttling that treaty. And why that treaty is important is because it's a foundational treaty that most of our allies have relied on. From my perspective, I live in Alaska. Now, Alaska and Hawaii under the existing shield are not covered. Now, Alaska produces 25% of domestic oil, which is critical. Hawaii, as we all know, is the center of the Pacific Fleet, very critical strategically. I want to see these regions protected, believe me. The point is, with these kinds of systems, we may be creating bigger problems than those that we're trying to guard against. We need to walk very carefully when man plays God by manipulating the environment in a very specific way for weapons applications. We need to make sure that we're doing it right and that we're not going too far. And this has not been done. The public debate has not been there for these systems adequately to convince us that they can be done safely. Energy weapons in terms of high-powered lasers and pulsing energy is a very important concept, and I want to explain this concept. And it comes out of an article from the Los Angeles Times, and there's some patents to cite it, but let me just paraphrase it and explain what it means. If you take the energy of 2 car batteries, okay, it's not very much energy, right? But you take that energy and you compress it and you release it in 150 billionths of a second, 150 nanoseconds, just this little short amount of time, it equals the generating capacity of the United States by 20 times because you compress that energy and you release it in a very, very short amount of time. That creates a tremendous surge of energy, pulse of energy. Those are the kind of things that are used for knocking out electronics, but with very high efficiency because in that fraction of a second, you've bursted that energy out. But we're talking 2 car batteries there. Now a device was actually built by a guy in his garage that demonstrated this. And it would knock out everything. In fact, I got to find the quote now, and it says, it could take the energy contained in 2 car batteries, compress it, and release it in 150 billionths of a second, thus exceeding in those 150 nanoseconds the electrical generating capacity of the United States by about 20 times. In so doing, Aurora simulated the high-energy gamma rays that could scramble the electronic controls of everything from toaster ovens to guided missiles, unquote. And it's called, the article is Cold War Doomsday Machine Meets Own Dooms, Los Angeles Times, March 1996. Interesting. Because that's the whole principle under pulsing energy. Now think about things like HAARP that have an effective radiated power of 1 billion watts. Or think of even smaller systems that might be mounted on trucks that might have, the equivalent of 100 car batteries. You're talking about tremendous amount of energy. I want to go back to a couple other concepts. In terms of mind control, one of the things about the Gulf War that we heard about, was how did we do this? All these guys running out panicked, and the story was, well, we bombarded them with so much ordnance that, they just gave up. It never washed well with me, because I think about Dresden, Germany in World War II. I think about London in World War II, where every day and every night bombs are going off. Nobody was doing that. But we suspected, but we didn't know until a couple of years, several years actually, after the conflict ended. It showed up in the Scottish press. They were using what is called a silent subliminal that was embedded on the radio broadcast played in the region. Now the radio broadcasts were playing the music, the Muslim music and the Muslim prayers that everybody was dialed into. And underneath it, silent subliminals that created panic and fear. Now the same technology, we cite the patent where it came from, which gives it a little bit more meat to hang on the bones of that idea. But then the commercial aspects used in Japan right now, where they're playing in department stores, the elevator music that you're listening to when you're in department stores. Well, underneath it in 7 languages, they have little messages to dissuade shoplifters. And they've been able to chart, their progress. Very successful program, and it's great they're dissuading shoplifters, but, God forbid that they get into a situation where they need more sock sales and they get you to buy 10,000 pairs. The point of the matter is, again, whether it's used for that purpose or some other purpose, there is never, ever a reason why or an excuse for manipulating the free will of any living soul. God won't do it, man shouldn't do it, and when he does, he commits one of the ultimate sins. He violates the very essence of who we are as created images of God by affecting us, doing something that even God would not interfere with. And yet man, for commercial reasons or for military reasons, would seek to do that. We have to oppose that. The idea that, well, would they really use it against Americans? The answer is yes. And I'll tell you, the toughest chapter to write in this book was on human experimentation. It was hard, because as we looked at each thing, and Secretary of Energy O'Leary made the statement that over 500,000 Americans had been experimented on by weapons technologies over a 40-year period. 500,000, that's how many they admit to, without their consent. Now this involved several things. Black Americans in the southeastern United States being injected with syphilis to see how they would die over time. Native Alaskans being injected with radioactive iodine to see how they might be affected over time in Arctic and subarctic conditions. Service personnel given LSD and other drugs to see what would happen. Or worse, placed inside of trenches while atomic blasts went out in harm's way to see how it might affect them over time. School children sprayed with chemicals, biological agents to see what would happen and how disease spread through populations. We cite the sources, we cite their own documents that lay that bare. The idea they would do it, would they do it today? Think about the anthrax vaccines that they wouldn't license for general use. Think of some of the other vaccines used in the Gulf War that they wouldn't allow for general use. And yet they're experimenting on service personnel, and a failure to say yes, what does it mean for those guys? They get booted out of the military with dishonorable discharges. Maybe they go to jail. Because they don't have the right to say, I don't want this under my skin. And yet, they don't have the same political rights you and I have either. They can't object in the same way that we can object. Yet, the people that we're asking to risk their lives, we're asking to risk their lives twice. and to remove their choice about what goes on in their bodies. This is a fundamental flaw. And yet, the only people that can advocate for them is you and I, because they don't have the same privilege to object that you and I have. And yet it continues to this day. We need to buckle up, belly up, and say, listen, tell our congressional delegations, let people decide what goes under their skin and not the government. Let people decide, military personnel decide what's safe and what isn't. One of the other things that showed up in Revolution in Military Affairs and Conflicts Short of War was the idea of injecting transceivers under the skin of military personnel. This is from 1990. So that if they were caught in a prisoner of war situation, we could locate them easily with geographic positioning systems, GPS systems. But they didn't stop there. They also suggested that any American traveling overseas should also have one of these transceivers. Because after all, you know, it's a volatile world, and if something happened, we'd want to get you out. But don't worry, we won't turn them on until you leave the country. The whole idea, again, is where do we draw the line? There's a lot to say about privacy, and one of those things is what goes on under our skin, we should be deciding, not our government. What goes into our children's heads and our heads, we ought to be deciding, not our government. The idea in the Revolution of Military Affairs and Conflicts Short of War went even further, and they suggested that the new technologies that were coming would violate American principles and value to the extent in which Americans would object to their deployment. And they said instead of stopping there where you think they would stop, they said we need to change American values. And they created two scenarios to do that. One was to create villains, international drug traffickers and terrorists who we would look the other way when their civil rights were violated, because after all, you know, they're big threats, the same way people thought about Jews in Germany before World War II. Because the fact of the matter is, under our system of justice, you're innocent until proven guilty. That if you suspect someone of a crime, and one of the things they suggested was we could knock out their aircraft using these new weapons, cause them to crash. And what happened if that guy who received the message heard the message as terrorists when it was really an airplane load of tourists? Could that happen in our government, as efficient as all those people are? Of course it could. The fact of the matter is, they suggested that because it was outside of the country, the Constitution wouldn't apply, and that is again wrong. When our service personnel swear an allegiance to that Constitution, it goes where they go. They represent who we are. They represent our values. They don't change our values. They represent our values in a way that we can be proud of. And the idea of presumption of innocence, juries, trials, we did not make them judge, jury, and executioner. We have to insist that those civil liberties apply in all instances, or we stand for absolutely nothing. The United States has the opportunity, if they can detect all of this, follow them until they land and arrest them and give them their due process of law. Because where you start drawing that line artificially, we all are in trouble. When you think about who's tagged as an adversary, it's anyone who stands against American policy, whether it's protesters at the WTO in Seattle, protesters in Washington, D.C. this week, objecting to the World Bank and the World Trade Agreements there. The fact of the matter is, we have a right to carry our agenda. Our government should reflect that agenda in its public policy. And when it tries to influence the behavior of Americans to further their own political ends, it is fundamentally wrong and violates every aspect of our Constitution and American way of life. These systems go much, much further. There's a lot to be said in terms of privacy issues and these issues that are now upon us, and we need to reframe our thinking in a way that takes us to a much, much better conclusion. The next issue I want to cover really gets into some of the privacy questions and some of where this new technology goes in terms of privacy issues. But just before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some more of the positive side of some of this science, because I think that's very important to see sort of the flip side of this equation. One of the things that comes up with mind-altering technologies are there things that might be beneficial or might be good? And you know, there's a couple of things I want to talk about in terms of other forms of mind control that are a little more obvious to most people. The use of chemical compounds Prozac, Ritalin, the things that we hear a lot about when it comes to small children and even adults, some of the most prescribed medications in the country. And these are really about changing human behavior, right? These are about modifying human behavior. And there was an initiative during the Bush administration that was pushed forward, and this initiative was the idea they were going to go in. It was supposed to be funded by $400 million. They were going to go into inner city schools, isolate out the people that were demonstrating rebellious kind of characteristics or non-conforming characteristics. And they had decided, this group of psychologists, that these types of characteristics manifested because of some genetic basis. In other words, these folks that were maybe with a tendency towards criminal behavior, it was genetic rather than choice. In other words, it was just another illness. Pretty bizarre. I mean, the whole idea, it goes back to Nazi Germany when they thought the same thing. The fact is, what they wanted to do was go in and test young people, interview parents at length, interview teachers at length, and then medicate inner city young people on a mass scale to modify their behavior. Now, let me say this, that when I was young and in school, I challenged authority quite a bit, because it was my nature, you know, to ask questions, and you know, and I felt that teachers ought to have answers, and if they had sort of pat answers that really weren't answers, you know, I wasn't satisfied with that. Now the difference is, I was lucky I had very good teachers. I was blessed by teachers that understood that that kind of inquiry wasn't a challenge to them, and they were secure enough in knowing what they knew to not feel uneasy about that. But the same characteristics that create leaders can create criminals. It depends upon how their energy is organized. If you take people that don't conform out of the picture and you not only dumb them down, but now you numb them down, you've got a problem in your next generation of leadership, because these are people that don't conform in the traditional way of conforming. They always challenge, they want more information, you know, they're inquisitive. These are the very people that you want to get them to think in the right direction by giving them incentive to head a different direction. The reason I bring that up is when you think about mass drugging of the country, fortunately it was stopped. There were a number of psychologists that found that this whole concept of genetic correlations between behavior was ridiculous. But even in the most recent news this year, we're hearing this come up again 7 years later, being posed in the mainstream. I remember hearing Brokaw one evening saying, you know, isn't it interesting that we might be able to solve crime as a genetic problem? This is dangerous business in terms of what could happen. But talking about sort of the other side of it, when you're using Ritalin or one of these drugs to take a hyperactive child and slow them down, or take a child whose brain activity is not fitting into the right frame to pick it up, you really don't get the result you want. You get kids that are kind of in a fog, not really focused. There's other ways to achieve this. Now, you and I naturally, when we sit down and we read a book, our brain activity flows into that right frame to where we can take the material in, remember the portions we need to remember. We do it naturally. Well, a lot of young kids don't do that naturally. And there's a number of reasons why. I mean, there's a lot of environmental factors that contribute to the problem. But one of the things that's been found to be quite useful is a thing called brain biofeedback. Now, what that is essentially you're hooked up to an EEG, these things that connect on the outside of the skin that measure brain activity, and it's fed directly into a computer, so you see in real time on the screen in front of you what your brain is doing. Now, for little kids, they don't want to see a bunch of squiggly little lines. So they design software that maybe has a bouncing ball. And when they bounce the ball at the correct level by, you know, fooling around with their own brain activity and the way they focus their attention, they learn how to bounce that ball so that their brain wave activity is in that frame where they can learn. And what they found is after 30 or 40 sessions of about an hour apiece, most kids can learn how to focus their attention and learn without Ritalin or any other drug, and do what we do naturally. In fact, do it a little bit better than what we do naturally, because they're trained very specifically. And the difference is they're directing it, not someone else. They just learn how to exercise that muscle, if you will, the brain, in a way that allows them to learn how to focus that attention. Very, very powerful in terms of what we can do. Now, why wouldn't the pharmaceutical industry be too excited about that? It's pretty obvious, you know? It's all about money. The thing about it is that's an expensive therapy. Now, everyone in this room, everyone who hears this video is going to say, I know someone who's hyperactive or has a hyperactive kid or has an attention deficit disordered kid. You know, I want to know what we can do. First of all, this therapy is expensive. It's not inexpensive to tie up a clinical psychologist for an hour or a biofeedback practitioner for an hour 30 times. But I'll tell you the organization. There's an organization, it's a Biofeedback Association. They're based in Denver, Colorado. They're in their yellow pages. They have practitioners that are certified all over the country. It's something that communities need to pull together. Churches need to pull together. When we have those kids, find a way to get them the treatment, get them off of that Ritalin, get them off of the drugs that are really hurting them and damaging them. The biggest injustice, the biggest inhumane aspect of these weapon systems are the technology that's being developed for military applications is denied to health practitioners, the very people that need this knowledge that could revolutionize medicine in this country. When you're talking about systems that can kill, you're also talking about the same systems that mean that we've learned enough about our physiology, our internal makeup, to perhaps change the shape of medicine. And I would suggest that in our lifetimes, we're going to see electromedicine as a concept become more and more mainstream. It already is in many parts of Europe and other parts of the world. It's going to be here, and it's going to lend itself to some great, great changes. The other thing I want to talk about as it reflects on all these technologies is the effect on young people in terms of military personnel. Think about what military personnel go through in their upbringing today. First of all, they're exposed to unprecedented volumes of violence through the media, through television, all the things that deliver violent messages and sort of desensitize children, young people, to violence in and of itself. Then we enter the battlefield environment. Now think about the Gulf War. The Gulf War and the direct conflict, over 100,000 people on the other side died, and in the direct conflict, a couple hundred on the U.S. side died. Pretty extreme ratios. Now take a look at Kosovo, where tens of thousands on the other side died, and virtually no one on the American side died in combat. Now, why is that? It's because our technology is taking us further and further from the engagement itself. So now, sitting at the end of a computer terminal is a guy playing the equivalent of a video game, delivering ordnance into the battlefield, delivering weapon systems to the battlefield that are killing thousands of people. Now the difference is when our fathers and grandfathers came back from battle, they had the smell of death still in their nostrils and a desire to not see their children and grandchildren engaged in the same thing. Because we all recognized that that's the last thing we ever want to do. Sometimes a country's called into those conflicts. But if it becomes easier and easier to engage in those conflicts, we'll be engaged in many, many more than perhaps we should be. We're making conflict and killing too easy. We're taking the humanity out of it. And we're conditioning this next generation to accept that as okay. This is one of the greatest sins, is to kill. We have to exercise a decision on whether or not we kill for our own defense, whether or not it really is our own defense, or are we protecting the interests that are quite contrary to the American value systems, to American interests? Are we just protecting multinational interests, corporate interests, economic interests that work against us as much as they work against other countries? We need to ask about the engagements we're engaged in, and we need to ask about the direction in which our wars are fought. And we need to find ways to make sure we maintain the absolute toughest decision-making matrix when we decide to get engaged. We just can't get involved in every conflict for economic reasons. It's just fundamentally wrong. Going back to sort of where some of these technologies go, and this is one of the big concerns, is one of the things that the military is very concerned about is the media attention to conflict. Because obviously, as we saw in the Gulf War and we saw in Kosovo, as soon as the photos start coming back, we all get real excited because we don't like the idea of particularly innocent civilians getting killed. And it happened in both conflicts. I mean, we can go back and look at all those photographs and think about it, and it ends up shutting down the effort. So getting the media removed, non-lethal weapons are one of the things that they came up with, because if there's nothing to photograph, there's no carnage to photograph, then it doesn't make the 6 o'clock news and doesn't generate the kind of concern that people with values, ethics, and morals might have when they watch people get slaughtered. The other side of that is non-lethals are not really non-lethals. In fact, everything you see in the military literature talking about them, they say, yeah, there is a certain level of lethality that can occur with these weapons. And they lay out a couple of things. Let me give you an example. One of the things that came up, sticky foam, we hear about it in all the media reports. This is stuff that they spray and you're stuck, and you can't go anywhere. And they discovered that it really didn't help much because if they had a gun, they were stuck by their feet, but they're still shooting the gun. So they decided to solve this. So they inject electricity into the sticky foam. So now your muscles convulse and you just pull the trigger randomly. It's just bizarre. This is non-lethal. But think about non-lethal. Think of sticky foam on your face. What would you rather have? Suffocate to death or a bullet in the head? The fact of the matter is non-lethals can be very lethal. Pepper gas, the things they used in the WTO. The gases they used there against American citizens. Do you realize that you can't use those same things in combat? It violates biological and chemical treaties. And that treaty has an exemption in it. It's domestic use. What you cannot use against a declared enemy, you can use against your own citizenry. And over 100 people have died from pepper gas in the United States because they have lung disorders that cause asphyxiation because you have asthma or something where that really affects you and kills you. Non-lethality, according to the military's own definition, is a weapon that doesn't kill over 25% of the time. A Claymore landmine does not kill over 25% of the time, and it's far from non-lethal. Because it doesn't usually kill, it usually just takes feet off and legs off, but you might live through it. Blinding lasers, remember when they came out? The idea that you could blind somebody permanently using laser weapons, and they were quickly outlawed by international convention within months of being discovered by the average person in the public when the media finally took the issue up. Many of these systems, these weapon systems, would be equally objectionable to the mass of American public and the world public if they knew they existed. And this is, again, part of our work is to carry these issues out there. And just since this book's been out, when we tabulate up the amount of radio we've done on the subject, we've probably hit a good 30 million people so far. And that's increasing. We do a lot of things to get the issues out. But the issues have to get out because that's the only way in which things will shift or change to any degree. One of the other things is this idea of black projects, which comes up all the time. What is a black project? It's a project by the military or intelligence community that's so secret even the United States Congress doesn't get the information. A handful, a dozen or so or less of our congressional leaders actually get to know something about these projects. But they get to know about it in a closed room behind closed doors with one team that has a very specific agenda is only going to inform them to the degree in which they feel they need to inform them to get the money. Now, how much money is involved? United States Air Force budget, according to the Washington Post, in 1997, 40% of the Air Force equipment budget. That's a huge budget. Remember, a new bomber is about $1 billion. 40% of the Air Force equipment budget alone was for black-funded projects. This is a huge amount of money with no accountability. Accountability really is the issue because as we move into the privacy questions, this is where sort of the rubber meets the road. Because as the government becomes more opaque and more difficult to look inside of, to see what's going on, our lives become increasingly transparent. Essentially, at this point in our history, what we used to think of as private is now available to anyone with a will to know. I mean, whether it's what they're scanning in the grocery store, your medical records, any public records that are digital, any medical records that are digital, virtually anything in a computer bank dealing with your finances is available to anyone with the will to get that information. The government's ability to get that information is tremendous. In just one database alone on American citizens, 3.5 billion records are kept, where once they've got your name, they can find out lots of things about you. Now people go, well, I don't have anything to hide, what am I worried about? It's the same thing they used to say in Nazi Germany as they kicked in your door. I mean, in Alaska, they tried a program called Knock and Talk. This is where a 6x6 rolled up with National Guardsmen and 2 straight troopers came to the door, knocked on the door and said, "Hi, mind if we come in and look around?" They did this in Chicago and they did this in Puerto Rico also. Now, Alaska's the last place you want to do this because, we're pretty non-conforming up there. We still have a little bit of a frontier spirit, and there were a lot of state troopers booted off the front porches of a lot of Alaskans. It lasted about 2 weeks. The fact is, this kind of approach to invasiveness is happening. And we have to look at privacy differently. What we used to think about when someone came to our door is privacy began at the threshold of our doorway. We have to think in different terms. Our digital doorway, the information that is held on us, is just as private as what is across our threshold. Because we haven't drawn that line is only because our law has not caught up with our technology. Technology, since the invention of the wheel to where we are today, is doubling every 9 to 10 months. That is a tremendous rate of change. Where does that take us into the future? According to April's issue of Wired magazine, Sun Microsystems, it's the only one making money right now in the fall of the stock market. They're one of their primary scientists and founders said that within 30 years, computers are going to be 1 million times more powerful than they are now. In our book, we say in 10 years they'll be 1,000 times more powerful, which is about right as you extrapolate things out geometrically. Now, what does that mean? That means one of two things. Either the computer on your desktop is going to be 1 million times smaller in 30 years, or 1 million times more powerful. Now, think about the capability that's involved when you start to miniaturize technology. And what that miniaturization is referred to is nanotechnology, things on a 1/1000th scale, nanotechnologies. Now, you have nanotechnologies on one hand, you have information technologies, which we all understand, computers and the like, and then next to it you have biotechnologies, things like cloning, growing brain cells on circuit boards, which they now can do on substrates of electronic circuits. Now, brain cells, they go, well, you can't do anything with a brain cell unless you got neurons. And this was the big trick. How do you grow neurons? Well, 3 weeks ago, the Salk Institute, you can go to their website and see it, announced that they grew neurons. Now you can grow neurons and brain cells and merge them into electronic circuits. That technology exists today. Now, as it advances and you combine information, miniaturization, and biotechnologies, you'll form a new science. Because when you look at sciences, it's always that way. If you go back in time, sciences tend to merge and form new forms of science that get new names, and we introduce those. And like nuclear science, that didn't exist 100 years ago, now it exists. Everything kind of gets combined, but what is it the outgrowth of? A lot of other types of engineering and sciences merging together. The same thing happens when these merge, except you're talking about super machines. In fact, what is projected in the next 30 years is machines that are capable of thinking and reasoning on their own, evolving themselves. In other words, machines that can build new machines. And as they build new machines and look at their logic circuits, and they look back at what humanity's doing, how will they view humanity? With the kinds of things we do to the planet. The kinds of things that are spoken about in Revelations 11:18. How will they view us? As viruses, or will they view us as parasites on the planet? Will we be a hazard to their health? It's an interesting concept, and it's the concepts that are painted by some of the leading scientists in the world right now and looking forward into the future. I mean, literally right now, even in this month. We lay a lot of that foundation months ago when we were researching and writing this book because we see it coming. Now, the fact is, where does all of that go? If you take the acceleration, you talk about microcircuits, microchips that people keep bringing up. Well, the first references we saw to them were in military documents going back to 1990, and we cite them. But think about the computing power of a modern desktop computer being able to be reduced to the size of a grain of rice. That is powerful. What can you do with that? You're starting to see it in the mainstream media. You see the ad of the guy going through the grocery store, shoving stuff under his coat, and he gets out, and then he runs out the door, and the cop chases him and hands him his receipt. It's because they figured out everything he took, they figured out who he was, and they sent him the bill and debited his account. That type of advertising is conditioning us for what's coming. Okay, it's right around the corner because they're already promoting it. We show the technology, we show the patents, we show how that rolls up. It's coming and it's not too far off. The reality is they're doing it for our own good. Another example is when you go to the bank and they ask you for your thumbprint now to cash your check. Call the bank and tell them you're moving your account unless they quit doing it. We did it in Alaska. When a bank got sold to a new bank, we said, look, we're moving our accounts. We're telling all our friends. I do a lot of radio. I'm going to announce it to the world. And you know what? The new bank, when it came in, doesn't require that. You got to say no. We'll move our money elsewhere. If they won't regulate it at the national level, talk to the little guy who's your state senator, your state representative, and make them install laws at the local level, because you can. That's what's happening in our state. We can do it where the rubber meets the road, where you can eyeball these guys and tell them what you object to. Thumbprints for kids, they may not think about it. We think about it because we always equated that with criminals. We didn't think about it the other way. Bill Clinton, a few weeks ago, he announced a new initiative. This is kind of interesting. He does these executive orders periodically that are supposed to be so wonderful. Well, this one was to forbid being able to use genetic information of federal employees, not you and I, protecting federal employees, public servants, giving them another layer of protection that you and I don't have. Does that make sense? And what they're saying is they want to restrict that availability of that genetic information because an employer who sees a predisposition to some illness may say, look, I don't want to hire this person because they might get sick in 10 years or whatever. Or maybe they'll have bad criminal genes, right? And maybe they're really thieves in wait. This is ridiculous. The idea that this information should be protected from one group of people and not all of us. We are equally, we deserve equal protection under the law. It's a basic principle. We keep hearing them say it on the television in the last 3 or 4 weeks over other issues. Equal protection under the law. Ladies and gentlemen, we need that equal protection of the law. If there needs to be surveillance, let it be of government offices so we can find out what our employees, our public employees are doing rather than the other way around. It's an upside-down equation. Wouldn't it be nice if a parent with a restricted code could access their kid's classroom and see what's going on? To find out if their kid's behaving, if the teacher's actually teaching? Wouldn't it be nice to dial into the road maintenance crew's lounge to see how much coffee they're drinking in a day? Or how about dialing into some other office where they're really understaffed and say, hey, wait a minute, we got all these guys sitting around here for 3 days. Why don't we move that money over to this office where we need some work done? And they're overworked. Why don't we look in instead of the other way around? We have the technology. We have the capability. And why shouldn't we be able to observe our public employees? And you know what? They're some of the most protected people in the country in terms of privacy. We cannot look in by law in this country and do any of that without a major change in the law first. The idea of public accountability is, in fact, the only way to create the kind of changes that we're talking about. When you talk about things that are going on in terms of privacy, many of us have read the reports now, and we cite those, of where in Europe, to find a rapist, they're taking the DNA samples of every male person in the community to weed out the innocent. Where's the presumption of innocence there? And people are doing it. People are walking in, giving their blood samples. Their DNA, the most sacred part of who you are, the blueprint for your life. What God gave you as an individual to lay out who you were going to be. And they want to put it in a data bank and make it available to whoever wants to look at it. This is fundamentally wrong. This is no different than kicking in your bedroom door. It is fundamentally wrong. The idea that people are signing up and doing it, where things have really gotten out of hand is Great Britain, where they started installing cameras. Now, when you come and go from the country, you are photo imaged. You do not walk in and out of Great Britain without an image. Cameras now are so small you can get them down to 1/10 of an inch cubed with high resolution, which means the cost of cameras is dropping dramatically, and as a consequence, it's becoming more and more economic to install them on a wholesale basis. In New York City, and we quote it, they've got them all over the city along with microphones. You can't even walk down a street in New York and have a private conversation. And the mayor of that city suggests, you're in a public place, you're not entitled to privacy. Wait a minute. This is a whole concept that, okay, so when you leave your house, now you get no privacy? That is not the way most of us think. We assume we have a private life. Unless we're suspected legitimately of a crime, someone gets a proper warrant and exercises that warrant. And what they're doing is creating an environment of paranoia and fear, so we give up our civil liberties in exchange for what we think is security. Good example, guns, right? This is the big one right now. 15,000 people in America got shot and killed by guns last year. Seems like a big number. 98,000 died from medical malpractice. And the only time you hear about that is when someone's carving their initials in a woman's abdomen. Now figure that one out. Where's the bigger crime? Where should the attention of the public be focused? On getting decent medical practitioners and a system of accountability. for medical practitioners that can't get it right. But you know what part of their solution is for that? It's an interesting solution. All of your prescriptions now are going to be fed into databases to protect insurance companies from claims, because a lot of this malpractice is by subscribing 8 or 9 medications from 2 or 3 different physicians. They all interact and kill somebody. So now you load all that information into the computer, and now the insurance company will call the doctor and say, hey, look, here's a cheaper medication, use this one, and by the way, this one might have a side effect, so don't use it because you're interacting with drugs. Now that seems good and seems reasonable, but it's how far do they go? Because the other half of it is they're going to tell them to prescribe other medications that are more economic. You know, and we're starting to see some of that, right? I mean, in terms of HMOs are getting nailed because of this nonsense telling doctors what to do. Now there's a certain level of that makes sense, and other levels of that don't make sense. We need to look at our technology, we need to protect our civil liberties, and what's available to government or anyone else needs to be protected. AOL got in trouble. Okay, they got in trouble because people were diving in, using that system, diving into medical sites and trying to find information on perhaps an illness they had or maybe a family member had. And then they were giving that information to people advertising stuff, right? So they could target you in terms of selling to you. Well, the problem is, you know, this is your medical information. This is, you know, they don't know whether it's you or a family member or who, but they have no right to sell that. They got in big trouble, they had to stop. The fact is, if they can do it, they will do it. Zbigniew Brzezinski said it himself. He said no matter who is in power, liberal or conservative, the inclination to use this technology and to do so to further their political ends would be greater than their good sense to restrain. Now, that was 1971. The European Parliament, you know how they refer to these weapon technologies? They call them the technologies of political control. Because if you can control the attitude and behavior of populations, you run the game. If you can control what is public and what is private, you run the game. Think of the WTO. Now, anyone who was there protesting, and I agree with one aspect of what happened there. Anyone who was violent deserved to be dealt with swiftly and harshly under the rule of law. But the vast majority of those people were like you and me. In fact, if it was happening in this neighborhood, I'll bet you most of the people here would have been out on the streets saying, hey, we don't like the WTO. But you know what? As soon as you make that position, you're in opposition to the policy of your government. You are an adversary. If you read the documents that we cite within our book, you'll see really clearly what an adversary means. It means you're subject to higher monitoring, higher review of what you do. And you think, well, I'm just a face in the crowd. You're right. You're a face in the crowd. And you know what? They can scan all those faces in the crowd. We show the patents that prove it. And they can digitize that information. They can match it off against driver's license, passport records, mug shots, and any other photographic image they have of you and tell who was there. Then they can tie that data into all kinds of stuff about you personally. And if you show up in 2 or 3 of these, you might become a target because now you're in, you know, you're in this club of adversaries and be dealt with in the same way that people were dealt with in the 60s when they were involved in the civil rights movement. The only difference is you've got huge technologies capable of doing a much more efficient job than they could do that. Now, some of you have heard about Echelon. We first learned about Echelon 3 years ago. And this was the project between the United States, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and British governments, where after World War II we agreed to sort of trade information. Because on a wholesale basis, you can't spy, the U.S. can't spy on every citizen. So the Canadians do it for us, we do it for them, and we basically spy on each other's citizenry on a wholesale basis. Now in these 5 governments, there's 300 agencies that load in what are called dictionaries. These dictionaries are specific names of individuals or specific phrases, words, concepts, and even voice prints, and I'll tell you about those in a second. Now with that information, what happens is every time those words flow through either phones, faxes, email, any electronic communication, that information is extracted by supercomputers and downloaded to those 300 agencies where tens of thousands of technicians on a daily basis review the material. So they can pin down sort of soft intelligence, right? Then they get some information that shows who the targets are, and then they can really track down who your network of friends are, who your contacts are, everything about you in terms of your communications. Now with a voice print taken in as little as 4 seconds, it's as unique as your thumbprint. It's biometric information, information about you specifically that's unique to you specifically. With that, literally when you pick up a phone on some other part of the planet and start talking, if you're on their dictionary, if you're one of those folks that they want to track, they can tell where you're at, who you're calling, and what you're saying just based upon that digital piece of information that makes your voice so unique. And we cite the information, the patents, and the mainstream press reports on that technology. When you look at biometrics generally, what other kinds of things are there? The heat emanating from each of us is unique. We have a unique signature in terms of infrared that can be picked up. When they look literally through your house, and they got in trouble for this because they tried to introduce some of this as evidence without warrants. You know, they were driving by, looking through someone's house, getting information, then they went in and got warrants, and they got it all thrown out because they didn't have a warrant to look literally into your bedroom, because that's what they can do. If you ever looked, next time you go to the airport, you know the old machines that used to scan your luggage, you know, they just pick out the metal objects and they jump out. Take a look around the screen and see what they're looking at now. You can see everything in there. The plastic hair dryer, you know, everything that's in there, your camera, everything. It breaks down so you can see it in a three-dimensional image within that camera. That same technology can go right through your house with what's available now. And what's available in the future is even going to be more radical. Now, you may not think anything of that, but you know, when you think about privacy, again, these are the thresholds that we don't believe technology should cross. Because we have a technology does not mean we have to use it. The idea of genetic connections to our behavior or health is ridiculous in the sense that we don't know if something shows up in our genetic structure about our health, whether or not it'll ever manifest. Or whether maybe you're going to get an illness, but maybe it's going to be when you're 90. You know, and the things that deal with behavior really have to do with choice and free will, not chemical makeup. But any time that you can use chemical or biology, then that means you can use chemicals and biology for changing it. That's what Ritalin and Prozac are all about, changing our behavior. They're even talking about chemicals that can be evolved, and we cite those, where you can sort of pick your personality off a shelf. Now, this is nonsense. This is not what human beings were meant to do. But as societies become more complex, people's desire to escape the reality that we're in, these are things that happen. It's a sanctioned form of mass drug abuse, with licensed practitioners being the dispensers of those drugs, numbing down the population because dumbing them down apparently wasn't good enough. And it's happening now. When you talk about encryption and security, you know, we all think that's safe. There was a little test done a while back, and it was one of the best encryption codes. You know, they challenged people to try and break it. And some college kids in something like 48 hours with $250,000 or so worth of equipment broke the best codes there were. You remember when they were doing the Clipper chips that they wanted to stick in all the computers so they could come in, of course, only with warrants to see what you were doing? And then all of a sudden it kind of went away. They don't need it. That's the reality of it. They don't need that technology to invade your privacy through the internet. You know, if you're hooked up, you're hooked in. They want to look around, believe me, they can. Look at hackers, what they're going through. You know, in most computers that we have at home don't have firewalls, don't have protections. Even if they did, if the desire to enter that system were there, believe me, they can get there. The idea of privacy still being available to the average person in the public, it's just flat not there. But it's something we can insist on. It's something we can start to grab back before it's totally gone. One of the big purposes when you think about how much information, and I've told you how much comes in, how do you deduce it? How do you get it reduced down to something meaningful? This is very important because you can't do it as an individual. We do it, others like us do it, in order to deliver information in compact form in a credible way so you can use it, because it's tough to do otherwise. It used to be called investigative reporting. The military has given us a new name. Now we're accumulators because we were considered villains because we present national security risks. Let me tell you something. Weapons concepts and military concepts are not a risk. They're a requirement for us to discuss in a democratic republic. How to build the systems, I would agree. That should be a matter of national security. But what they do conceptually, we ought to have an opportunity to debate to discuss. And people say, well, then you jeopardize security. You know what? In democracies, in a democratic republic, there are going to be certain risks. Because to have an open government, that's the price of open government. Do we allow our government to continue to close the door? Do we allow our government to continue to insulate themselves at our expense, literally at our expense, while the rest of us are exposed to more and more scrutiny, so we can be controlled and directed in a more deliberate way? Because that is the outcome. Think of the media. Think of every time you turn on that news and you hear the latest report. Are they trying to persuade us with information, or are they trying to manipulate us with emotion? And there's a big difference. And I want to point this out because it's fundamental to what I believe is a rational and reasonable presentation of information, whether it's on this subject or any other subject. If someone is motivating you strictly emotionally, this is a kind of motivation that turned citizens like us into murderers in Germany because they were emotionally motivated. They quit thinking, the brain turned off, and they started doing things that they normally wouldn't do. And that's manipulation. From my perspective, manipulation is the essence of evil. When you manipulate the behavior of other people by withholding or shaping information in a way to further your argument, that is fundamentally wrong. On the other hand, persuasion is delivering the information in a way where you're also receptive to new information. So you give your information out, and people say, wait a minute, you missed this, you missed that, you take it in. And eventually between you, you evolve a solution that makes sense because you persuade one another with the facts rather than the emotion. The other side of that is emotion is a very important part because if you take the facts and you put emotion behind those facts, it locks them in. You think about them, you lock them in, you're attached to them, they mean something to you. This is a big distinction because if you look at the mainstream media, most of what you see is purely manipulative. The other side, and I want to draw this out a little bit in terms of some of the other things that are happening. You know, in terms of police forces and what's going on there, the militarization of police ought to be evident to everyone. I mean, we all got SWAT teams in our towns now trained by the military. But take a look at what happens when you take community policing sort of out of the equation. You know, community policing is a local thing. You know, it's where the person you went to school with becomes a sheriff or police officer. People you respect, they know your community, they participate with you as real human beings, not as some detached thing, but a real person. Now you have lots of federal money flowing into police force, and with it comes strings. And you also have this change in mindset. The place where you see it the most is the big cities. Think about Los Angeles. Now think about the kind of tactics used in Los Angeles, where the law isn't good enough, so 30 police officers get suspended because they've been falsifying evidence in hundreds of cases. Have you read about that yet in the paper? It's in there. Because they manipulate the evidence to do what they think is good, forgetting the values under which we function. The idea of having evidence and presumptions of innocence. You may have some villains out there, and some of them are going to get away. I can tell you that. But if we start stomping on the civil liberties of everyone, eventually it will be us. Because I can tell you, Christian people are not viewed as friends of the government. Look at the literature, and we point it out. They consider us radical nonconformists. I think that's great. But I just don't want them shooting at me or my friends. And the fact of the matter is, because we take strong positions and because we're a strong political force, because when we act, when we have faith and we step into the game, we're the mainstream of this country from all different beliefs. And they use things to divide us and separate us, to dilute our power as people. They use politics to manipulate our behavior. What was interesting about our work in Europe, this was the classic, is we had conservatives and Greens and social democrats, which would be the equivalent in the United States of having Republicans and Democrats and independents all working for the same thing. That they couldn't stop. There are issues that we can find common ground. When we find that common ground, use it. You know, the best support we've ever gotten started with the Christian community, the far right. The far left finally came on board. I don't have much respect for a lot of the folks in the far left, but I know one thing. When you talk about these issues, the issues of privacy and civil liberties, it strikes us all the same way. Because fundamentally, the thing that made this country great is that we could be different in so many ways and yet find common issues where we could move forward together and create the biggest changes. Whenever the mission was big in this country, people pulled together around that mission, recognizing their differences. I remember a day in my own state when politics was of this type. Republicans and Democrats would go head to head, beating the heck out of each other. But at the end of the day, when the votes were cast, they could sit down together and be civil to one another and work together on those issues they found common agreement on. Look at the things that are separating us now, and mainly it's the influence of multinationals who use us to play off of one another, to manipulate us for their own political ends. Whether it's the Republicans or Democrats, it's right-wing, left-wing, same bird, ladies and gentlemen. Same bird when you look at the outcomes. At the local level, there's still a chance. At the federal level, it's less of a chance. At the presidential level, it doesn't matter which one wins. They'll get us arguing over the social issues while they run away with the bank and our freedom and every other issue that's also important. At the local level, we still have a fighting chance. But we can't wait for people to step up to the plate. Look in your communities at the people that stand out. Move them into the game. Support them. Convince them to run for those local offices. Get them involved in local politics. Get them involved in your state legislatures. You can still make a difference. Prophecy is here, and I'm not saying I'm a prophet. I'm a researcher. I deliver science. But that science, I believe, supports what we're seeing the prophets of old and the prophets of new say. But prophecy is to warn us. It's to send a message to us. It's not to condemn us to death. It's to say, hey, wake up, change the course, take an action. Faith is that simple thing that I said earlier. Step into the game. Somebody asked me, well, is there a group we can join? Is there something we can do? You know, this always comes up, and you know, I've done a lot of organizing in my life. And you know, people say, well, you don't look that old. I'm 41. I've got 5 kids from age 6 to age 22. So I've seen a little bit there too, so I know what families are about. But I can tell you, it's a matter of stepping into the game. You don't have to wait. Remember that leaderless revolution I was talking about? You're it. There's more power in this room than is needed to change the very face of the planet. Period. I've seen it happen. I've seen it with a handful of folks. We started our work 7 years ago in this particular area with a mortgage on our house. We sold a little bit of property. And to date, we've made and spent over $1 million on this effort internationally. I mean, every month we kind of wonder what's going to happen the next month because we put it right back in the work. But nobody could have told us 7 years ago that we could have done that. And we did it because of people like you doing something. The fact is, as soon as you start taking actions, the rest reveal themselves. And there's a big difference. You know, when you're up against the wall and you want to do something, you just know you got to do it. And we've all been there, right? You really believe in something, you know you got to do it, and you fight and you struggle and you get to the other side. And when you get to the other side, you go, oh, God, rescue me from this. Because there's a difference in the way in which faith works and our own personal agenda works. And the way faith works, from my experience, is you step into it and you do feel a little resistance, but it tends to move away. If it doesn't move away readily, chances are it's probably not of God, it's of us. It's our ego pushing that door, pushing that wall. That's going to be begging for help on the other side. May not mean it's the wrong direction, just might mean it's the wrong timing. The fact is, what's in front of us should be a joy. It should be able to be exercised with love, compassion, joy, not with anger, not with fear, not with hate. In all the work I've done, I have never experienced fear in any of it, because I know I do not walk alone. The organization I'm talking about, you are all a part of. It's the church, and the church isn't a building, it's us, individually. It's inside our soul. It's who we are. Scripturally, that's what the church is. What's a witness? Is it what we say? I don't think so. I think it's what we do. A testimony is what we say. You know, I feel sorry for the guys that come up to my mother-in-law's house and knock on the door who think they're witnessing. And these guys have a rough experience. They walk in the door, she sits them down, and then she drills them and says, you know what you should really be doing is finding out who on this street is too old to mow their yards, too old to take care of the things they need to take care of. You want to do something? Do that. And then maybe they'll ask you what you believe. And you'll have a chance then to testify. Witnessing is what you do, what you see someone do. Step into the game. It might be a simple thing as a smile, as I said earlier. It might be more complex. But whatever it is, it'll be clear to you, and it will not create stress. It will not create anxiety, because God doesn't give us things we can't handle. We give ourselves things we can't handle. We step into complex issues that we go, why did I do this? And the reality is, we have to reclaim that birthright, what Christ came back to remind us of, which was to wake up the potential of God when He works through us without us getting in the way. And a lot of the getting in the way has to do with our attitudes towards how we approach the things in front of us. And they're really quite simple. Try. Pick an issue, any issue. A simple thing everyone in this room can do. Very simple. First of all, commit to continue to look for the truth. If you're not a Christian person, commit to that, and you'll lead yourself down a spiritual path that you maybe didn't bargain for. But don't sell yourself short. Commit to a search for the truth. Secondly, do something simple to demonstrate that search, that effort. Take a piece of white paper, on it, write something that you can do in 10 minutes. Write a letter to a friend, talk to a friend, make a phone call, read something meaningful and pass it to somebody. Whatever it is, call a radio station about an issue you're mad about. Whatever those things are, put it on a white sheet of paper and slip it in with your bills, because you'll see them every month. And when you pull them out, do that one thing. As you're struggling through that financial part of your life, which for most families is the most stressful part of their life, take and do something that's good for someone else that makes you feel good, that furthers your faith, that demonstrates your capacity and capability. Simple thing, 10 minutes. And I'll guarantee you, after a year of doing it 10 minutes a month, you'll probably find yourself doing it a lot more, because it's a really thrilling experience when you start to see the fruit of that effort. And you'll get excited about it. You won't feel stressful, just the next thing will show itself. And that example, pass that on. That's the organization. The organization is, you're standing in it. Whatever you do, there's millions of other people doing something just like it. Trust that. It's unstoppable. It's incredible. It's what Christ came to tell us. Love each other, act in love, do things that are meaningful. They don't have to be big things. You know, did Christ go to the place where we're all sitting? No. He went to the places where nobody else would probably go. He met people where they were. He didn't pass judgment on them in that moment. He encouraged them by an example. First, an example. And then it was, why is that? You know, somebody would ask the question, and then the testimony began. There's a big difference. What we do is important. That demonstrates to people who we are. Some of the things that happened last year that were so devastating, we had so many people digging into the foxholes. People who believe in eternal life worrying about death. Sad situation. It's one thing to be secure and be prepared. It's another thing to be motivated by fear, because it's not from God. And I'm not saying that because we should feel guilty and uptight about it. I'm saying it because we need to recognize that what people need to see in us is honest effort to make a change, to make a difference. Even in the most hopeless situation, you know, because it isn't about winning. It's not about winning or losing. It's about trying. The winning or losing is in somebody else's queue. The trying is in our queue. The effort is in our queue. That's the step of faith. If we lose, the world says you lose. Maybe you didn't. You know, I'll tell you a Chinese story. It's an interesting story. It's an old story, but it's a good one. There was this guy, and he had a horse, and he's very poor, and he sends this kid to the market to sell the horse because he needs the money. And the horse gets away, and the community says, "Oh no, how horrible, how terrible, you've lost the horse." And the father says, no, it could be good or it could be bad. The next day, the horse shows up, brings 7 wild horses with him. And the village all comes out and says, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. And he goes, no, it could be good or it could be bad. The next day, his son is trying to break one of the wild horses, gets thrown from the horse and breaks his leg. The village comes and says, oh, this is horrible. He says, no, it could be good or it could be bad. And the next day, the military comes through, grabs all the young men for war except for the guy with the broken leg. And the moral of the story is what looks bad may not be bad. It might be the lesson we need, or it might be protecting us from something else. And we can all look back on our histories in life, no matter how short or how long they've been, and bad news usually converts to good news, and the thing that hangs it up is how long it takes us to wake up to what we were supposed to learn in the first place. You know, I learned it young. I learned it with the loss of my father. He died when I was 12 on a plane crash, disappeared, never was found. But the majority leader of the House, the United States House of Representatives, Hale Boggs, who some of you may have remembered the story, he was the third in line to be President, Hale Boggs. You know, Nixon, Agnew, Hale Boggs, Speaker of the House, then Hale Boggs, fourth in line. That's the way it ran. They were on a plane flying from Anchorage to Juneau. The plane disappeared off the radar screens. Poof, they're gone. Never found, biggest air search in the history of the United States. 3 weeks later, his election happened for his second term, and he won. You know, the guy that eventually won in the special election is still there today, who has the distinction of being the only congressman ever to be beaten by a dead man. And if you knew the guy, you know, it wouldn't surprise you. The fact of the matter is, for me, that changed my life, changed my brothers and sisters' life, changed my whole family's life, quite frankly. But even in that, as horrible as it was, and it was like a missing in action, you know, or a prisoner of war, because they never did find them. But, you know, you learn from that. And what we learned in that, what I learned in that is, no matter how bad it is, you can wake up to a new reality. And usually it's the bad, the worst, that can change you, that can modify who you are. Death, divorce, the horrible things in life are the greatest opportunity for change. For me, it totally turned me around as a young person. I went from a CD student to a 4.0. I took a very serious look at life, and my whole life changed from that event. The fact is, every negative event is what we make it. We can wallow in it. Some people do. I remember watching my grandmother wallow in that one for the last 20 years of her life. I mean, it'd be the toughest thing to lose a child. But they're opportunities. They're meant to wake us up. They're meant to focus our attention. It was 20 years later that we found out the truth. And the truth was, it was found out by a reporter for Roll Call, prestigious magazine in Washington, did some Freedom of Information Act requests. It's interesting, Hale Boggs, for those who don't know, he was on the Warren Commission. He wanted to reopen the Warren Commission. 6 months before the plane took off, he called for the resignation of J. Edgar Hoover, who, for those that don't remember, he's a pretty corrupt guy. If he didn't own you, that's how he stayed there. He manipulated the Congress and anyone that was in his way by using the national security forces, our government forces, to further his own political ends. They found out that a couple of people had come into an FBI office in Long Beach and said, hey, we located the plane, there's 2 people still alive, surveillance technology, really good stuff we had back then, back in the early 70s, as far back as that. 3 days later, they came back and said, hey, why haven't you gone and picked them up? There's 2 people there, here's their coordinates. Those telexes went to Washington, D.C. to J. Edgar Hoover's desk, and that's where they sat for 20 years. And we got them, under, from the reporter that did the story. With all the names, of course, blanked out, so no one's held accountable. And, for my mom, it ended her political life. She left Alaska, that was it. For the rest of us, it was another further motivation, because we suspected that as kids, even growing up. We'd seen enough of government to know what it was about. And people doing good things don't last long when they're the only leadership. The thing I can tell you is, when we capitalize on who we all are and begin to act accordingly, those things will not happen. We need to open the doors of government. We need to provide mechanisms that allow people to come forward and tell the truth. Look at what South Africa did. This population of blacks suppressed by an oppressive government, what did they do when they got their government back? Did they throw everyone in jail that had oppressed them? No. They gave them an opportunity to come forward and disclose the truth. And in exchange for that truth, they got forgiveness. These are fundamental Christian ideas. Let people tell the truth and be forgiven. Provide the mechanisms in government that allow people to step forward, identify the truth, because I can tell you when we see the truth of what's happening in our government around these issues and countless others, this government will change. We need to find those mechanisms, create those mechanisms, starting at the local level. We've done it in Alaska. We've got systems in place that allow for some accountability and opportunity for average citizens and other government employees who have something to say to come forward. But we need to carry that further. We need to carry that into our federal system. There are a lot of things still hidden in darkness that need to come into the light. And if we don't insist on the changes, we'll never have the opportunity to take the government back that we own. Science and technology is what makes governments strong. Think about it. Chinese are making 50 cents a day. Russians are making, PhDs are making $50 a month. And they're controlling technologies that make them our biggest threats. And why? Science and technology is what makes government strong. But you know what's behind science and technology? You know what's behind governments and our way of life? It's you and me. We make the government what it is, or not, by our apathy. People say, oh, no one participates. 15, 16% show up to vote. I say, hurrah, you only have to convince 8% that you're right. You know? Is it good news or is it bad news? Depends on how you look at it. Take control of the government, know the science and technology, the things that make government strong, and we can regain our freedom. And together we can walk towards that 1,000 years of peace. Thank you very much.
Let's give him our appreciation. Good job. Good job. Absolutely. Now, folks, the question is, what do you do with all of this information? How do you respond to it? Well, I'm going to use this analogy. You know, Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We've all sinned. We've all made mistakes. Every one of us has made mistakes. How do we get to heaven? Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for it is by grace you are saved, through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Okay, so what does that mean to us? Let me give you an analogy. If I can hold this microphone and take my watch off at the same time. All right, let's say, for example, I were to say to you, brother, if I were to say, I tell you what, I'm looking at my watch, gold watch, and if I were to say, tell you what, if you sit there for 5 minutes more, I'll give you this watch. Is that a gift? No, that's a wage. He had to do something for it. You see, the gift of eternal life is exactly that. It's a gift. If I were to say, tell you what, I'll sell you this watch for $1. Is that a gift? No, that's a bargain. Amen? But if I were to say, tell you what, here, you can have this watch. Now that's a gift. But when does it become his? When he reaches out and takes it. But see, he's not reaching out to take it. But I tell you what, at the very instant he flinches, I'm ready to pull it back. And you see, it's exactly that same way. Jesus is reaching out to you every day of your life with eternal life. He's saying, here it is. Take it. It's free. You can't pay me for it. You can't earn it. Only the difference is, he's not ready to jerk it back. He is offering eternal life to you every day of your life. And you know what he's saying? He says, here, take this eternal life. Come to paradise. Live with me forever in peace and joy and happiness, where there's no more tears. There's no more growing old. And you know what a lot of Americans are doing? No, not me. I want to burn in hell. I want to spend eternity. I want the worms to come out. I want to burn all of that. That's not what they're saying. But that's what they're saying. Amen? That's exactly what they're saying. And all the time, all of their life, Jesus is reaching out, saying, here it is. Eternal life. Take it. Just reach out and take it. And yet some people are saying, not me. I don't want to be happy for eternity. Peace, prosperity. I mean, unbelievable. It says that the mind has not seen, eye has not seen, or the mind has not conceived of what God has laid up for those that love Him. And all we have to do is reach out and take it. So the question then becomes, all right, if we want to reach out and take that eternal life, then how do we do it? Romans 10:9 and 10 gives the answer. It says, if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God has raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, but with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. What's that saying? It's simply saying, folks, it's not enough to say it and not believe it. And it's not enough to believe it and not say it. You got to say it and you got to believe it. Now, I'm going to take it a step further. Let's say, for example, that, I'll get back up here. Let's say sin is right here. This represents the ditch that we've all been in. Amen? Don't sit there and say, holier than thou to me. We all been in that ditch, right? We got that mud all over us. Say the ditch is here. And let's say holiness is over here. Here's what happened to us. We were over here in the ditch in the world, and we were walking along having a good time, for the most part. And then this finger out of the sky pointed down and said, you know, boy, you're a sinner and you're going to hell if you don't get right, if you don't receive Jesus. And we said, oh, well, I don't want to go to hell. Okay, Jesus come into my heart. We prayed the prayer. But how's our life? A lot of times Christians are still in the sin. We got the same mouth, the same friends, the same habits, the same bad sinning. And what Acts 2:38 says is repent. That means turn our back on that old life. Repent. Every one of you in the name of, repent. Every one of you in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. So what does repent mean? It means walk away from it. Now, does that mean that we can walk from sin to holiness in one step? No. It is a step-by-step process. He says, be ye holy, for I'm holy. If you love me, you keep my commandments. Pick up your cross and follow me. It's a step. We have to resist the devil, and he will flee from us. And I find that there's a lot of Christians that have never made a commitment before men and before God to live without sin. They said, Jesus, come into my heart, but they're still in the ditch. We got to get out of the ditch. We got to walk. Does that mean we're going to be perfect? Does that mean we ever make it over to holiness? No, especially not by ourselves. But we can do all things through Christ, which strengthens us. So what we need to do is work towards holiness. I find a lot of Christians have never made a commitment to live a holy life before God. Now, it doesn't mean that they're perfect, but it means the objective to be is perfect. Now, I also find that a lot of Christians have never said, God, you can have the steering wheel to my heart. In other words, they want to be a Christian, but they don't want to let God be in charge. They will still want to live their life. They still want to do what they want to do. And they haven't ever, so to speak, put their job application up on the king's desk and said, I want to go to work. To whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean full-time, but to whatever degree God wants to put you to work, you're just basically saying, I want to go to it. It depends. It doesn't make any difference how far or what it is you tell me to do. If you tell me to do it, I'll do it. So there's three things we're about to do. First of all, we're going to pray and ask Jesus to come into our heart to wash our sins away so that we can reach out and take that eternal life. And then I'm going to go to a second step, and I'm going to ask the cameras to stay with me. The second step, where we're then going to ask people to rededicate their lives. So let's all bow our heads, no one looking around. Yes, you may have prayed this prayer before. I pray it every day. Let's say it again all together. Dear Heavenly Father, I admit I'm a sinner. And I confess with my mouth, and I believe in my heart that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, died on the cross, arose 3 days later, sits at the right hand of the Father. Ask Him to write my name in the book of life. Keep me holy and save me in the day of trouble. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, if you want to make that second commitment where you're saying, I'm going to promise from here on out, I'm going to do my best to live a holy life, and I'm willing to go to work for God, then what I'm going to ask you to do in just a moment, I'll ask you to stand. We're going to make that commitment together. We're going to pray and make that commitment before God and before men. So if you want to make that second commitment, making your objective to live without sin and to work for God, please stand.